I paid $42,000 for 6 weeks of silence, and my mother destroyed it in exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, which is how long that phone call lasted, because I timed it. Because timing things is the only skill I have left that nobody can take from me. If you're watching this from a beach right now, from a hotel room you saved a year for, from the 1 week of quiet you finally bought yourself, comment the city you're in, hit like, and subscribe. Because what I'm about to tell you is the exact moment I stopped being the daughter who pays for everything and became the woman who ends everything. 3 things were happening at once that first night in the house on Sandpiper Key, and I need you to hold all 3 because they don't resolve in order, they resolve when they're ready to resolve. The first was money. $191,000 had moved out of the Ridgeline Family Trust in the 11 months since I resigned from Callaway Voss Financial Forensics, and I hadn't authorized a cent of it, and my signature was on every single withdrawal form. The second was my fiancé, Grant Ellison, 36 years old, a man I had known for 4 years and was supposed to marry in April, who told me he had a work trip to Charlotte the week I left for the Keys. Except Grant does not work in Charlotte. Grant has never worked in Charlotte, and I found that out because I am, professionally, a person who finds things out. The third was simpler and uglier. My mother, Carol Vance, 61 years old, had decided that my healing, my resignation, my breakdown, my $42,000 act of self-preservation was actually a shared family vacation she had simply not been informed about yet. I need to back up because none of this makes sense unless you understand what I actually do and what I actually walked away from, and why a house on the water in Isla Mirada, Florida, with unlimited quiet and a private dock and absolutely no one else's name on the lease, was the only thing standing between me and something I'm still not sure I want to name out loud. My name is Elena Vance. I'm 34 years old. For 9 years, I was a forensic accountant, and for the last 3 of those years, I was a junior partner at Callaway Voss, a boutique firm in Coral Gables that companies hire when they suspect someone inside their own walls is stealing from them, and they need someone who can prove it in a way that survives a courtroom. I have spent my entire adult life reading bank statements the way other people read novels, looking for the sentence that doesn't belong, the transaction that's grammatically correct but means something is very wrong. I built my career on the fact that people who steal money almost always leave a rhythm behind, a pattern, because human beings are creatures of habit even when the habit is fraud. I have testified in federal court 4 times. I have a photographic memory for account numbers, which is a strange and useless party trick until it isn't. And 11 months ago, I resigned from Callaway Voss on a Tuesday morning at 8:52 a.m., walked to my car in the parking garage on Ponce de Leon Boulevard, sat down in the driver's seat, and did not cry, because I don't do that in front of witnesses, even when the only witness is a parking garage security camera. I resigned because I had spent 4 months building a fraud case against a client's CFO, a man named Preston Okafor who had been quietly draining a manufacturing company's pension fund through a shell logistics vendor for 6 years. And on the morning I was supposed to hand the finished case file to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, my managing partner, a man named Dale Whitcomb, who had mentored me since I was 26 years old, took me into his office and told me the client had resolved things internally, and the case was closed and I would be moving on to the next engagement. Resolve things internally is a phrase forensic accountants learn to hear as its true translation. Paid someone off, including possibly the person telling you this. I asked Dale directly whether Callaway Voss had accepted money to bury a 9-figure pension fraud. He didn't answer. He just looked at me the way you look at someone you're about to lose and already know it. I typed my resignation letter in the parking garage on my phone, standing next to my car, 40 minutes before I was supposed to be in a meeting about it, and I sent it before I could talk myself out of it, and then I drove to my condo in Brickell and slept for 14 hours and woke up not knowing who I was without the thing that had organized every hour of my life since I was 25. That's the part nobody in my family ever asked about. Not one question about Preston Okafor, not one question about the pension fund, not one question about whether the 9 years I'd spent building a reputation as the person who catches people had just been quietly erased by the very firm that trained me to catch them. What my mother asked, the day I told her I'd resigned, was whether this meant the wedding budget for me and Grant was still intact, because she had already told the ladies at Cascade Point Country Club that her daughter's fiancé was a director at a private equity fund, and my unemployment, however temporary, was an inconvenience to a story she had already told other people. So when my severance and my accumulated bonus cleared, $168,000, after 9 years of 80-hour weeks, I didn't buy a car. I didn't buy a ring back from Grant, which, in retrospect, I should have considered. I rented a house. A real one, a 5-bedroom cedar and glass place on stilts at the end of a private lane on Sandpiper Key in Islamorada, with its own dock, a hammock between two gumbo limbo trees, and a rental agreement that specifically listed my name, Elena Marguerite Vance, as the sole authorized occupant for a term of 6 weeks beginning June the 1st. $42,000, I paid it in full, in cash, from my own severance because I wanted 6 weeks where no one could tell me what my time was for. I got there on a Sunday. I unpacked exactly 4 bags because I hadn't wanted to bring much. I wanted the house to be empty of everything except me. No photographs, no inherited furniture, no evidence that anyone had ever needed anything from this space before I did. I made coffee in a kitchen that smelled like cedar and salt. I sat on the dock at 6:40 in the evening and watched a heron stand so still in the shallows it looked taxidermied. And for the first time in 11 months, I felt my shoulders drop an inch. Just an inch. The kind of release you don't notice until it happens and you realize how long you'd been braced. At 9:14 p.m., my phone rang. My mother's contact photo, a picture I'd taken of her at my cousin's wedding 3 years ago, mid-laugh, diamond studs catching the light, a photo she'd chosen herself and asked me to set as her caller ID because she liked how she looked in it, filled the screen. I answered because I always answer. That's its own kind of diagnosis, I think now. Elena. Her voice had the particular brightness she uses when she's already decided something and is calling to inform, not to ask. We are moving in tomorrow. Your father agreed to it. I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with it. Alone, on a dock, 310 miles from the nearest person who loved me the way I needed to be loved right then. We are moving in tomorrow. Not may we come. Not would it be all right. A statement of fact about a house I had paid for with money earned from 9 years of a career I had just lost, delivered as though I were a hotel concierge being informed of an incoming reservation. Mom, I said, and my voice came out flatter than I expected. This is a 6-week lease. It's in my name. There's no room. There are 5 bedrooms, Elena. I looked it up. Your father found the listing on the county property records in about 4 minutes. We know exactly what we're walking into. A pause. The specific pause she uses before she delivers the sentence designed to end an argument by making you the unreasonable one. If you truly hate it so much, go find somewhere else. I sat there with the phone against my ear, and the heron finally moved, unfolding into flight over water gone the color of a bruise in the last light. And something in my chest went very cold and very quiet, the way it used to go cold and quiet in a conference room at Callaway Voss, the moment I found the transaction that proved someone had been lying to me for months. I didn't cry, I didn't raise my voice. I felt my mouth do something that in the mirror later I would recognize as a smile, the kind that doesn't reach anywhere near the eyes, and I said, very softly, "Okay, Mom, come on down. I'll get the guest rooms ready." I hung up. I sat on that dock for 11 more minutes, and in those 11 minutes I made a decision that would take the next 5 weeks to fully execute, and would end with federal agents walking into a country club gala in dress shoes that had never touched sand, and would end with my mother's name in a filing at the Monroe County Clerk's office that she will not be able to explain away to a single woman at Cascade Point ever again for the rest of her life. But that part comes later. First, you need to know about the money, because Loop A, the one that started with a signature that wasn't mine on a withdrawal form for a trust I didn't even know had been touched, started 3 weeks before that phone call, in a spreadsheet I opened by accident, looking for something completely different. At 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in my condo in Brickell, back when I still thought the worst thing that had happened to me that year was losing my job. And you need to know about Grant. Because Loop B, the quieter one, the one that hurt in a completely different part of my chest, started with a hotel receipt that came through on a shared rewards account I'd forgotten we still had linked, for a Marriott in Charlotte that Grant Ellison never once set foot in, because the charge posted from a boutique inn in Highlands, North Carolina, 90 minutes away, on a weekend he told me he'd be in back-to-back due diligence meetings. Both of those things were already true, already sitting in my life like unexploded ordnance, on the night my mother told me she was moving into a house she hadn't paid for. I just didn't know yet how deep the fuses ran, or how many of my own family members were standing on top of them. 3 weeks earlier, back in Brickell, I'd opened my laptop to check on my late grandfather's trust. A formality, really, something I did twice a year out of habit more than necessity, because the Ridgeline Family Trust had been sitting quietly since my grandfather Everett Ridgeline died when I was 26, holding just under $2 million, structured so that distributions required 2 signatures. mine as the named successor trustee, and my mother's as the income beneficiary. It was supposed to be boring. It was supposed to be the single most boring financial instrument in my life. I had structured half of it myself, back when I was 26 and freshly credentialed and desperate to prove to my grandfather that his faith in making me trustee instead of my mother, a decision that had caused a rift at his funeral that never fully healed, had been the right call. The portal loaded slower than usual. I remember that specifically, the way you remember irrelevant details right before your life changes. The 3-second spinning wheel before the account summary populated. And when it populated, the number at the top was wrong. Not wrong like a typo, wrong like someone had been quietly reaching into a room I thought only I had the key to, month after month for almost a year. $191,412. Gone. In 14 separate distributions ranging from $8,000 to $31,000, spread across the 11 months since my resignation from Callaway Voss. The exact 11 months I had been too depleted, too raw, too busy trying to remember how to be a person without a career, to check on a trust I had every reason to believe was untouched. 14 distributions, each one requiring my signature as trustee. Each one bearing my signature. I did not sign those forms. I sat in my kitchen in Brickell at 11 at night with my laptop open and my hands very still on the keyboard, and I did the thing 9 years of training had built into my spine before it had built into my conscious thought. I stopped feeling anything at all, and I started building a file. The signature itself was the first tell, and it was almost elegant, in the way fraud sometimes is before you find the seam. Whoever had done this hadn't forged a wild approximation of my handwriting. They had traced the exact loop of my E, the flat cross of my V, the small hook at the end of my last name that I've made the same way since I was 9 years old and my grandfather taught me cursive at his kitchen table in Ridgeline, Georgia, the town he'd named half his life's work after because his own grandfather had founded it. A trace isn't a guess. A trace requires a physical or high-resolution source signature to copy from. And I knew, sitting there at 11 at night, exactly how many physical documents in this world had my real signature on them in a form clean enough to trace. My divorce filing from my first brief marriage at 27, sealed in a box in my mother's attic in Coral Gables because she'd insisted on keeping the paperwork safe after I moved into my first apartment alone. I had let her keep that box for 7 years without a second thought, the way you let your mother keep things because that's what mothers are for. Until the night I sat in my kitchen and understood that box might be the single most dangerous object my family had ever had access to. I want to tell you who else was in that house in Coral Gables with access to that attic, because none of what happened later makes sense unless you understand exactly how many people had motive, and exactly how differently each of them wore that motive. My father, Richard Vance, is 63 years old, a retired high school history teacher who spent 31 years at Southridge High, explaining the causes of wars he never had the stomach to start himself. Richard is not a bad man. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the entire currency of my profession, and I refuse to abandon it just because he disappointed me. Richard is a passive man, which is a different and in some ways more dangerous thing. He has spent 36 years of marriage agreeing with my mother in the exact moment agreement was easiest, and disagreeing with her, never. Not once, not when it mattered. When Carol told the country club that Richard had advised a major utility company during a 2-year stint doing part-time bookkeeping for a co-op board, he let her say it, because correcting her in public was a fight he decided decades ago he did not have the energy for. Richard's pension from the school district pays him $1,400 a month above his Social Security. He has not, as far as I can determine from 9 years of watching how money moves through this family, contributed meaningfully to a single major expense since I was 19 years old. Every vacation, every car, every emergency roof repair on the house in Coral Gables has come from somewhere else, and for the last decade, somewhere else has usually meant me. My brother, Marcus Vance, is 31, 2 years younger than the number he tells people at parties, which is its own small tell if you're paying attention. Marcus works, technically, as a brand consultant, which as far as I have ever been able to determine means he has started 4 LLCs in 6 years, each one funded partially by a loan from either my parents or from me, and each one has folded within 18 months while Marcus has somehow, personally, never once appeared to suffer a material consequence. Marcus drives a car I am fairly sure he cannot afford on paper. Marcus's trait, if you need it in one word, is entitlement. Not loud, not aggressive, just a bone-deep certainty that resources exist to be extended to him, Because he is Marcus. Because he was always going to be fine. Because someone, somewhere, usually me, would handle the actual arithmetic of his life while he handled the performance of it. Marcus's wife, my sister-in-law Jessica Torrance Vance, 29, is the one I underestimated longest, which I'll come back to, because Jessica turned out to matter to this story in a way none of us saw coming, least of all Jessica herself. Jessica's trait is opportunism, but a specific, quiet kind. She doesn't create the opportunities, she just never once fails to notice one when it opens. And she has an instinct for which door in a room is unlocked that I have honestly, professionally, rarely seen matched outside of actual forensic subjects I've built cases against. And then there's my mother's older sister, my Aunt Patricia Vance Cole, 64, who I need to introduce properly, because Patricia is the reason any of what happens later was even possible. Patricia spent 22 years as a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of Florida, specializing in complex financial fraud, before retiring 4 years ago to a much quieter life restoring a bungalow in Key West. And, in her words, finally getting to read novels instead of grand jury transcripts. Patricia and my mother had not spoken, not once, not at a single holiday, in 9 years, ever since Patricia stood up at a Thanksgiving dinner when I was 25 and said, in front of the entire family, that she thought my mother was constitutionally incapable of seeing any of her children as anything other than instruments. And my mother had not forgiven that sentence in nearly a decade, because the worst insults are the ones that are accurate. I had kept a relationship with Patricia quietly, almost secretly, across all those 9 years, dinner every few months, phone calls when I needed to talk to someone who would tell me the truth even when the truth was unflattering to people I loved. I did not know, that Tuesday night in Brickell with the trust portal open on my laptop, that I was about to need her more than I had ever needed another human being in my professional life. I built the first version of my case file that night the way I have built 40 other case files in 9 years, chronologically, mercilessly, without a single assumption I couldn't source. I pulled the trust's full distribution history all the way back to the day my grandfather Everett Ridgeline died, 5 years before my breakdown, 5 years before any of this. For the first 4 years, the trust behaved exactly as designed. Quarterly income distributions to my mother, small and predictable, exactly the amount the original trust document specified, each one requiring both signatures, each one signed correctly, because for those 4 years I was the one reviewing every request personally, sitting across from my mother at her kitchen table twice a year, watching her sign her half while I signed mine. The pattern broke in month 58. That's the month I resigned from Callaway Voss. That's the month I stopped checking the portal every quarter, because checking the portal required a kind of attention I did not have left to give anyone, including myself. And that is the exact month the distributions changed shape. No longer small and quarterly, but large, irregular, clustered around dates I would later learn corresponded almost precisely to Marcus's third failed LLC folding, to a down payment on a car in Jessica's name, to a payment to a boutique inn in Highlands, North Carolina, that I would not understand the significance of for another 9 days. I want to be honest about something, because I promised myself I'd tell this story exactly as it happened, and not as a cleaner version I wish it had been. My first instinct, at 11:40 that night, was not rage. It was almost relief. Relief, because for 11 months I had believed the emptiness in my chest was entirely about losing Callaway Voss, about Preston Okafor walking free with a pension fund's worth of other people's retirements, about a mentor who couldn't look me in the eye. And some small, ugly, honest part of me understood in that moment that at least some of that emptiness had another, simpler cause. I had been robbed by my own family while I was too broken to notice, and some animal part of my brain had already known it before my conscious mind caught up, the way you sometimes feel a draft in a house before you find the open window. I closed the laptop at 1:52 a.m. I did not call my mother, I did not call Marcus. I did the only thing that has ever made me feel safe in my entire adult life. I made a plan, in writing, with dates and dollar amounts, and I decided I would say nothing, not one word, not one accusation, not one raised eyebrow, until the plan was finished being built, because I had learned exactly one thing from 9 years of catching people who steal. The moment you confront someone before your case is airtight, you don't get justice. You just get a warning shot that teaches them to hide better. Preston Okafor had never known Callaway Voss was building a case against him until the morning it was finished. My family was not going to get treated any differently just because they shared my blood. The next morning, I called the only person on earth who could help me build a case against my own mother, without either flinching or gossiping about it to the country club by Friday. My Aunt Patricia. I drove down to Key West that Thursday, sat on her porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea neither of us drank, and told her everything. The trust, the signature, the 14 distributions, the box in the attic. Patricia listened the way she used to listen to witnesses, completely still, her eyes never leaving my face, and when I finished, she was quiet for almost a full minute before she said the sentence that became, in a real sense, the spine of everything that followed. Elena, honey, I need you to understand something before you go one step further down this road. If your mother forged your signature on trust distribution documents, that is not a family disagreement. That is felony forgery, and it is likely wire fraud, and if Marcus and Jessica benefited from proceeds they had reason to know were improperly obtained, that is money laundering, and none of that changes one bit just because the woman who did it gave birth to you. You built cases against strangers for 9 years and slept fine at night. The question you need to answer, before we go any further, is whether you can build one against your own mother and still be able to look at yourself in a mirror afterward. I told her the truth, sitting on that porch in Key West with the ceiling fan turning slow circles above us and a rooster somewhere down the lane making noise it had no business making at 4 in the afternoon. I told her that after 11 months of losing my career, my sense of who I was, and apparently $191,000 I hadn't even known was missing, I could sleep just fine. What I could not do was let it happen again, to someone else, in some future version of this family. Because if I let it slide this once, unaccounted for, everyone in that family would learn the lesson that stealing from Elena costs nothing at all. Patricia agreed to help me build the case, quietly, off the books at first, using contacts she still had at the FBI's Miami field office and at the Florida Department of Financial Services, people who owed her favors from 22 years of putting away fraudsters far more sophisticated than my own family was ever going to manage. She made me one condition, and I have thought about that condition every single day since. She said she would help me build an airtight case, provable beyond any reasonable doubt, on one requirement, that I let the evidence, not my anger, decide the outcome. If it turned out my mother had a defense I hadn't considered, we would stop. If it turned out worse than I feared, we would not stop for anyone's comfort, including my own. It turned out worse than I feared. It always does, in this line of work. That's the thing television never quite captures about forensic accounting. The number is never the whole story, the number is just the door. And behind every door I have ever opened in 9 years, there has been an entire architecture of smaller decisions, smaller people, smaller betrayals, propping up the number like scaffolding. I just didn't yet know, that Thursday afternoon in Key West with the sweet tea going warm in the glass, how much of that scaffolding I would recognize, how many of those smaller people would have faces I'd known my entire life. I went back to Brickell that night and I started pulling everything. Bank statements, wire transfer records I was legally entitled to as trustee, property records, the LLC filings for every one of Marcus's failed ventures, credit card statements I had access to because 2 years earlier, in a moment of what I now recognize as catastrophic generosity, I had added both my parents as authorized users on one of my own credit cards for emergencies. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. The woman who forged my signature and drained my grandfather's trust also had a card, in my name, on my account, that she had used 4 times in the preceding year for charges that had absolutely nothing to do with an emergency, including a $940 charge at a jeweler in Coral Gables, 11 days before she called me on that dock and told me she was moving into my rental. I traced that jeweler charge first, because it was the smallest thread and small threads unravel the fastest if you pull them correctly. The receipt, once I requested it directly from the merchant using my authorized user status, listed the item, a platinum tennis bracelet, 42 small diamonds, purchased on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:15 p.m., paid for in full on my card, picked up in store, no shipping record, no gift receipt. I called the jeweler myself, gave them my authorized user information, and asked, in the flattest, most professional voice I own, who had picked up the item. The clerk, a young man who clearly had no idea he was talking to the actual cardholder's daughter, told me a woman matching my mother's description had collected it in person, and that she'd mentioned, while waiting for the box to be wrapped, that it was a little something for putting up with the family lately. I wrote that sentence down word for word in my file, time-stamped, with the clerk's first name and the exact minute of the call, because that is how you build something that survives a courtroom, not with feelings, with sentences other people said out loud that you can prove they said. From there, I built out the full architecture across 11 days, working nights because during the day I still had to pretend to my mother, to Marcus, to Grant, to everyone, that I was simply a woman on a long overdue break, decompressing from a demanding career, considering my next move. It is a specific kind of exhausting, smiling at your own mother across a dinner table, while a spreadsheet in your head is quietly counting the ways she has stolen from you. I got good at it fast, faster than I'm proud of, because 9 years of forensic work teaches you that the person you're investigating cannot ever sense that you're investigating them, and the safest place to hide a federal case is behind a face that looks like it's simply having a nice time. Marcus's part in the 14 distributions turned out to be direct and, honestly, almost lazy. 3 of the 14 transfers, $81,000 combined, had moved from the trust disbursement account directly into an LLC called Vance Torrance Ventures, an entity Marcus had formed 14 months earlier and dissolved 9 months later. Its sole listed business purpose, consumer brand strategy consulting. Its sole documented client, as far as any registered filing showed, non-existent. I sat with Marcus over dinner at my parents' house in Coral Gables on a Sunday, 11 days into building the file, and I asked him, lightly, the way you'd ask about anyone's failed business, what had ultimately happened with Vance Torrance Ventures. Marcus, who has never in his life detected when he is being tested, told me, cheerfully over a plate of my mother's pot roast, while Jessica sat beside him scrolling her phone and not once looking up, that the capital just dried up before the client pipeline could really take off, and that it was honestly for the best, because that space was getting saturated anyway. I asked, still lightly, where the initial capital had come from. Marcus said, without a flicker of hesitation, that Mom had helped bridge some of it, because that's what family does, Elena. You'd know that if you'd ever actually needed anyone's help for anything. I wrote that sentence down too, word for word, the moment I got back to my car in the driveway. Because a man doesn't say that sentence to a woman he suspects is quietly building a fraud case against his own mother. Marcus said it because he genuinely believed it, because in the architecture of entitlement he lives inside, needing help is a weakness only afflicting other people, and receiving stolen money disguised as a bridge loan from your mother is simply what family does. Jessica's involvement took longer to surface and turned out to be far more precise than Marcus's, which is exactly the kind of thing that happens when you underestimate the quiet person in a room for years, the way this entire family had underestimated Jessica since the day Marcus brought her home. The down payment on Jessica's car, a lease, technically, on a vehicle with monthly payments that exceeded what I knew Marcus's actual income to be by a factor of roughly 3, had been financed by a $19,000 wire that moved from the trust's disbursement account into an account jointly held by Marcus and Jessica 8 days before the lease was signed. What made Jessica different from Marcus? What made her the one antagonist in this story I never fully saw coming until it was almost too late was a text message. I found it because Jessica, in a moment of carelessness I will always be grateful for, had once used my old iPad 2 Thanksgivings ago to check her email and never fully logged out of an account sync that, through a chain of events too tedious to explain here, gave me visibility into a group text thread she'd forgotten still existed on a shared family cloud backup. In that thread, dated 4 months before my mother's phone call on the dock, Jessica had written to my mother directly, "If Elena ever actually checks that trust portal, we are all so cooked. You need a story ready, not excuses, an actual story." My mother had responded, 4 minutes later, "She hasn't logged into that thing in over a year. She's too busy feeling sorry for herself. We have time." I read those 2 messages standing in my kitchen in Brickell at 2 in the morning, and something in me went past cold into something with no good name, because those 2 sentences proved, beyond any argument my mother could later construct about misunderstanding or good intentions, that both women knew, with total clarity, that what they were doing was theft, and that my grief over losing my career was not incidental to the crime. It was the operating cover for it. My father's role was smaller and, in its way, sadder, which is a word I don't use often in this business, but it fits here. Richard hadn't touched a single distribution form. Richard hadn't signed anything, hadn't authorized anything, hadn't, as far as 11 days of forensic work could establish, taken a single dollar directly. What Richard had done was worse in a different way. He had known. I found this out on the same Sunday dinner where Marcus told me about the bridge loan when I stepped into the kitchen to help my mother with dishes, a task I'd volunteered for specifically because it put me alone with her for 11 minutes. Enough time to watch her hands, her face, the things people give away when they think the only witness is running a faucet. I asked her, casually, drawing a plate, whether Dad had ever mentioned anything about the trust lately, just checking in, since I hadn't looked at it in a while. My mother's hands did not pause on the pan she was scrubbing, not even a fraction of a second, and she said, "Your father doesn't concern himself with the trust, Elena, that's always been between you and me." Which was true in the sense that Richard had never once signed a form, and completely false in the sense that Richard had. 3 separate times, according to a burner-style prepaid phone I would not discover until much later, texted my mother variations of the sentence, "Are you sure this is smart?" A question he asked, and then, each time, allowed to go unanswered, unpressed, unacted upon, because Richard Vance's entire moral architecture for 36 years has been the difference between asking a question and doing something about the answer. I want to tell you about Grant now, because Loop B was moving underneath all of this the entire time. Quieter, and in its own way, it cut deeper than the money ever did. Which surprised me, because I would have told you, before any of this happened, that nothing could hurt worse than watching your own mother steal from you while you were too broken to notice. I was wrong about that. Grant Ellison hurt in a different place entirely. Grant and I met 4 years ago at a bar association mixer I only attended because a case I'd worked required expert testimony, and the attorney handling it insisted I network with the firm's litigation partners. Grant was not a litigator. Grant was there because his roommate from business school was one of the partners, and Grant, at the time, was 2 years into a job as an associate at a mid-sized private equity shop, the kind of job that sounds far more impressive at a cocktail party than it functions day to day. He was charming in the specific way men are charming when they've spent their whole lives being told they're the most promising person in every room. Quick with a joke, generous with attention, the kind of listener who makes you feel, for the length of one conversation, like the only interesting person at an event full of interesting people. We were engaged 2 years later. My mother, notably, adored him instantly and completely, in a way she has never adored anyone I've brought into this family, and it took me embarrassingly long to understand that her adoration of Grant had almost nothing to do with Grant himself, and everything to do with the story his job title let her tell at Cascade Point Country Club. The hotel receipt that started Loop B came through 11 days into building the Loop A case file. On a Wednesday evening while I was cross-referencing a wire transfer date against Marcus's lease signature, in a completely unrelated part of my life, through a shared American Airlines rewards account Grant and I had linked years earlier to pool points for the honeymoon we hadn't booked yet. A notification came through for a stay he'd charged points toward, at a boutique inn called the Whistling Fox in Highlands, North Carolina. Checked in on a Friday, checked out on a Sunday, the exact weekend Grant had told me, over dinner, that he'd be in Charlotte for back-to-back due diligence meetings on an acquisition his fund was evaluating. I looked up the Whistling Fox that night, out of nothing more than idle curiosity at first. The kind of thing you check because a detail doesn't quite fit, not because you suspect anything larger yet. It was a 9-room bed and breakfast, 90 minutes from Charlotte, the kind of place people go for anniversaries and proposals, not due diligence meetings, and it did not, according to its own website, have a business center, a conference room, or Wi-Fi reliable enough to run a data room, which is the single most essential tool for the exact kind of due diligence Grant claimed to be doing that weekend. I did not confront him. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't strategy this time, or not only strategy, it was that some part of me, the part that had just spent 11 days learning my own mother had been lying to my face for almost a year, could not yet absorb a second betrayal on top of the first, without something inside me actually breaking in a way I wasn't sure I could repair in time to finish what I'd started. So I did what I do. I filed it. I opened a second folder, separate from the trust case, and I named it. With the flat, clinical humor that has kept me sane through 9 years of other people's worst decisions, Charlotte. And I kept building both files at once, side by side, on the same laptop, in the same late nights, while pretending to everyone in my life that I was simply a woman decompressing on an overdue break. If you've ever sat across a table from someone you love while quietly documenting every lie they tell you, you already know the specific exhaustion I mean. And if you haven't, I hope you never have to learn it. If any part of this is landing for you the way I think it might be landing, hit subscribe now, because the next part is where the second loop starts closing, and I promise you it gets worse before it gets better, in a way I did not see coming even after 9 years of assuming I'd seen everything. I confirmed the Whistling Fox wasn't a one-time lapse within 6 more days, and I confirmed it the way I confirm everything, with a paper trail, not a feeling. Grant's corporate card, a card whose statements I had access to because we shared a joint household expense account for things like our future wedding vendor deposits, an account he'd suggested we open together 18 months earlier as a gesture of building our life together, a phrase I now think about with something close to nausea, showed 4 additional charges at the same inn over the preceding 7 months. Always on weekends, he'd told me were work travel, always paired with a restaurant charge at the same tapas place in Highlands, Casa Rhoda, always for exactly 2 entrees and 1 bottle of wine. I did not need a picture. I did not need a confession. 4 dinners for 2, at the same restaurant, on 4 weekends. He told me he was somewhere else entirely, is its own complete sentence. And I have spent 9 years teaching juries that a complete sentence made of dates and dollar amounts is worth more than any tearful monologue a defendant's attorney can construct. What I did need, and what took me 3 more days to find, was who. I found her through the restaurant itself, in a roundabout way I'm not enormously proud of but do not regret. Casa Rueda posted photos on a public social media account from a regulars wine night event 8 months earlier. And in the background of one photo, seated at a corner table with Grant, unmistakably Grant, was a woman I recognized instantly, because she had been at my own engagement party 11 months earlier, standing near the bar, introduced to me by my mother as a dear friend from the club committee. Her name is Denise Callahan Frey, 41 years old, twice divorced, a woman my mother has known for over a decade through the Cascade Point Events Committee, a woman who had eaten hors d'oeuvres at the party, celebrating my engagement to the man she had, apparently, already been quietly involved with for who knows how long before that party even happened. I sat with that fact for a long time before I let myself feel anything about it, because the forensic accountant in me needed the sequence to be exactly right before the rest of me was allowed to react. And once I laid the dates out in order, a much uglier shape emerged than a simple affair, a shape that connected the 2 loops I had been keeping in separate folders on my laptop as though they were unrelated. Denise Callahan Frey was not just my mother's friend from the club committee. Denise's late husband had been, until his death 6 years earlier, a private wealth manager, and Denise herself, I discovered through a state licensing database search that took me 11 minutes, held an active insurance and annuities license, and had, for the past 3 years, worked part-time as an independent financial consultant for a small handful of clients, one of whom, according to a single line item I found buried in the trust's own disbursement records under a category labeled simply advisory fee, was the Ridgeline Family Trust itself. Denise Callahan Frey had been paid $4,200 from my grandfather's trust, the same trust my mother had been illegally draining, for advisory services that, as far as I could determine from 11 days of digging, consisted of exactly 1 meeting with my mother at a coffee shop in Coconut Grove and a handful of emails coaching her, in language too careful to be accidental, on how a trustee's absence and inattention could be leveraged to streamline distribution timing without unnecessary friction. In other words, the woman sleeping with my fiancé had also been quietly advising my mother on how to steal from me faster and cleaner. I want you to understand that I did not scream. I did not throw anything. I sat at my kitchen table in Brickell at 1 in the morning with that discovery glowing on my laptop screen, and I laughed, once, a short, ugly laugh with absolutely no joy in it, because there is a specific kind of dark comedy in discovering that the 2 worst betrayals of your year are not only connected, but were quietly having wine together in a restaurant 90 minutes outside Charlotte, while you sat alone in a condo grieving a career you'd given 9 years to. I called Patricia the next morning and told her everything about Grant and Denise. And Patricia, who does not surprise easily after 22 years as a federal prosecutor, was quiet on the phone for a long moment before she said something I have carried with me since. Elena, I want you to understand that the money is the part the law can fix. The money is a spreadsheet, it's evidence, it's clean, it resolves. The part with Grant is not going to resolve in a courtroom, and I need you to grieve that part on its own terms, on your own time. Because if you let the anger about the money do the grieving for you about Grant, you will come out the other side of this with a very tidy legal victory and a hole in your chest that never actually got looked at. I told her I understood. I did not actually fully understand that yet. I understand it now, months later, in a way I didn't while I was still building the file, still smiling across dinner tables, still pretending Grant's Sunday night phone calls about missing me were something I could stomach hearing without my stomach actually turning. I kept building. 6 more weekends, 6 more Sunday dinners at my parents' house in Coral Gables, 6 more evenings of watching Marcus explain some new venture he was certain would finally work, 6 more evenings of Jessica scrolling her phone while contributing nothing except, occasionally, a comment sharp enough that I began to understand she saw far more of this family's dysfunction than anyone gave her credit for, and had simply decided, a long time ago, that the smartest use of that clarity was silence and proximity to whoever currently held the money. There was one dinner, the third Sunday of the 11-day sprint before I left for the Keys, that I think about more than any other, because it's the dinner where I understood exactly how each of them wore their particular trait, lined up in a single evening like specimens under glass. My mother spent the first hour of that dinner describing, in extraordinary detail, a fundraising gala she was co-chairing for the Ridgeline Family Foundation, a charitable arm my grandfather had established decades earlier, funded separately from the trust, that gave modest scholarships to first-generation college students from the town of Ridgeline, Georgia, and that my mother had, in the years since his death, slowly repositioned as a vehicle for her own social standing rather than the mission he'd built it for. She described, without a hint of irony, the exact seating chart she was planning for the head table, the designer she'd hired for her gown, the significance of being photographed. This year, standing beside the foundation's oversized commemorative check for the first time as co-chair, rather than simply a board member. My father nodded along at every pause, agreeing, the way he has agreed with her for 36 years, occasionally adding a small factual detail about my grandfather's original vision for the foundation that no one at the table, including my mother, seemed remotely interested in hearing. Marcus spent the second half of the dinner describing a fifth venture he was in early conversations about, this one involving something he called wellness-adjacent consumer branding, a phrase that meant, as far as I could tell from asking two clarifying questions, absolutely nothing, and he asked, with the specific casualness of a man who has never once been told no by the people at this table, whether I'd maybe want to be an advisor once I was back on my feet, a phrase that managed to be condescending and extractive in the same 6 words. Jessica said almost nothing all evening except, at one point, apropos of nothing, that she'd heard Isla Morada was supposed to be gorgeous this time of year, a sentence I did not think much of at the time, and that I now understand was the exact moment I should have realized my mother had already told the entire family about my rental house, weeks before she ever called me on that dock. I drove home that night with both folders sitting finished, or close enough to finished, on my laptop in the passenger seat, and I made the decision, somewhere around the MacArthur Causeway, with the lights of the port glittering off to my right, that I would take my planned 6 weeks in the Keys exactly as scheduled, because Patricia and I both agreed the case needed one final piece before it could go to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and, separately, to the Monroe County State Attorney's Office for the forgery counts specific to Florida law. A clean, current, in-person confirmation that my mother would, if given the opportunity and no legal deterrent whatsoever, simply do it again, because prosecutors and juries respond very differently to a pattern that is safely in the past than to a pattern the defendant is actively, currently, unrepentantly continuing. I did not know, driving home that night, that my mother was about to hand me exactly that confirmation herself, unprompted, wrapped in the single sentence that would end up doing more damage to her own defense than anything Patricia or I could have manufactured. "We are moving in tomorrow. Your father agreed to it. If you truly hate it so much, go find somewhere else." They arrived the next afternoon in 2 vehicles, my parents in my father's Buick, packed with more luggage than any 6-week visit reasonably requires, and Marcus and Jessica trailing 20 minutes behind in Jessica's leased car, the same car financed with $19,000 of my grandfather's trust. Windows down, music loud enough that I heard them turn onto the private lane before I saw them. I stood on the porch and watched all 4 of them get out, watched my mother survey the house, my lease, my $42,000, with the specific proprietary satisfaction of a woman inspecting a property she has already decided, somewhere in the architecture of her own mind, belongs to her by right of motherhood. She hugged me at the door and said, "Isn't this so much better, all of us together? You shouldn't be alone right now anyway. Elena, not after everything." And I let her hold me for exactly as long as a normal daughter would let her mother hold her. No longer, no shorter, because performance, I had learned very quickly, was now the entire job. I gave them the 2 largest guest rooms without being asked, because giving generously and cheerfully is a form of control too, and because I needed all 4 of them relaxed, unguarded, and talking freely for the next 5 weeks, not defensive. My father took the smaller room down the hall without complaint, the way he takes everything without complaint, and set up a card table by the window where he began, within the first 2 days, quietly working on a jigsaw puzzle of a lighthouse, alone, most evenings, while the rest of the house's noise went on without him. I watched him do this on the 3rd night and felt something unexpectedly close to pity, which I did not let myself indulge for long, because pity for Richard Vance had never once, in 34 years, stopped Richard Vance from doing nothing while someone else did something wrong in front of him. The pattern of those first 2 weeks established itself almost immediately, and I want to walk you through it carefully, because it's the part of this story where the traits I told you about earlier stopped being descriptions and started being demonstrations. Over and over, in scene after scene, the way a fraud pattern repeats itself once you know what to look for. Marcus, on the second morning, appeared on the dock where I was having coffee and asked, with no preamble, whether I'd thought any more about the advisor thing, because he'd had a really promising call with a potential investor for the wellness branding venture, and thought having Elena Vance, forensic accountant, on the letterhead would honestly change the whole credibility conversation. I told him I'd think about it. He thanked me, sincerely, the way you thank someone for a favor you've already decided they're going to do, and then asked, in the same breath, whether I'd mind if he borrowed my rental car for a supply run into Islamorada village, because his own car was, in his words, acting up a little. A claim I later confirmed through the car's own extended warranty service records was false. The lease car had no reported issues of any kind. I gave him the keys. I wanted him relaxed. I wanted him talking. 2 days later, on the dock again, in almost the exact same posture, he brought up the advisor idea a second time, this time with a specific number attached. Even just $5,000 to start as a consulting retainer, just to get the paperwork moving. And I understood, watching him ask his own sister for $5,000 9 days after I'd discovered $81,000 of my grandfather's trust money had already funded his last failed idea, that Marcus was not capable of hearing the word enough, that the concept simply did not register in whatever part of his mind processed requests, and that no amount he had ever received, past or future, was ever going to be the amount that satisfied whatever the actual hole in him was. Jessica's pattern showed itself more slowly, and more interestingly. On the fourth day, she found me alone on the dock in the early evening. The only time of day she seemed to seek anyone out individually, I noticed, always when there were no witnesses to whatever she said, and asked, with a directness that startled me after weeks of watching her say almost nothing at family dinners, whether I actually believed Marcus's businesses would ever work. I told her I didn't know. She looked out at the water for a long moment and said, "I used to think they would. I don't anymore. I think Marcus needs to fail publicly, one time, all the way down, before he'll ever actually try instead of perform. But I also think if that happens while I'm still married to him, I go down with it, and I've done the math on that more than once." I wrote that conversation down that same night, word for word, in the case file. Not because it was legally relevant to the trust fraud, but because it told me something I needed strategically. Jessica was not loyal to this family's dysfunction out of love. She was loyal to it out of proximity to resources, and proximity is a much more negotiable thing than love, which meant Jessica, alone among all of them, might eventually choose self-preservation over covering for my mother, if the incentives ever lined up correctly. I filed that thought away and did not act on it yet because it wasn't time yet, but I want you to hold on to it because it becomes important later, in a way that surprised even Patricia. My mother's second demonstration of exactly who she was came on day 6, over a dinner I cooked myself. Grilled snapper, a salad with mango my father had actually picked out at the market that morning, one of the few small acts of initiative I saw from him the entire visit. When my mother brought up, unprompted, the foundation gala again, now only 5 weeks away, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd love for me to come back to Coral Gables a few days early, before the 6 weeks are up, to help with some of the final logistics, since you have the free time right now anyway, and I could really use someone who actually understands numbers for the vendor contracts. I said I'd think about it, she then added, turning to my father. And obviously we'll need the dining room set up properly for the pre-gala dinner with the board. Richard, so we should plan on being back in Coral Gables the week before regardless. A sentence that made clear, with zero acknowledgement of irony, that she was already planning to leave my rental 5 days early to prepare a fundraising event using a house she had moved into uninvited, discussing logistics for an entirely separate property, as though the 6 weeks I'd paid $42,000 for existed primarily to serve as a convenient staging ground for her own social calendar. It was on day 9 that Denise Callahan Frey's name came up at that dinner table for the first time since I'd discovered her connection to both Grant and the trust, and I had to work harder than at any other point in those 5 weeks to keep my face doing what a normal daughter's face does. My mother mentioned that Denise had been such a rock helping plan the gala's silent auction, that Denise had such a good eye for these things, and asked whether I remembered her from the engagement party. My mother said, entirely without guile, she's actually been such a help with some of the foundation's financial paperwork too. She used to do that kind of consulting work. You two should really talk sometime, professional to professional. And I sat there with a forkful of snapper halfway to my mouth, understanding in real time that my mother had no idea. Genuinely, completely no idea that the woman she was casually suggesting I network with was both the architect of her own fraud strategy and the woman currently sleeping with my fiancé in a bed and breakfast 90 minutes outside Charlotte. I said, sure, maybe sometime, and I put the fork down, and I excused myself 5 minutes later to check on something on the dock. And I stood at the end of that dock in the dark for almost 20 minutes, with my hands gripping the railing hard enough to leave marks. Not because I was going to lose control, but because that was exactly the amount of physical pressure it took to make sure I didn't. Grant called that night, as he did most nights, his voice warm and easy through the phone, asking how the family visit was going, whether I was getting any actual rest, whether I'd thought any more about moving the wedding date up now that I had all this unexpected time. A sentence that would have sounded sweet to literally anyone else on earth, and that I now heard as a man checking, casually, methodically, whether the timeline he needed me distracted for was still on schedule. I told him the visit was a lot, but manageable. He said he missed me. I said I missed him too, and I want to be honest that some small, stupid, 4 years invested part of me actually meant it when I said it, even as the rest of me sat with a folder named Charlotte open on the laptop beside me. 4 dinners for 2, documented in dates and dollar amounts, a woman's name and photograph attached, ready. Patricia drove down from Key West on day 11, ostensibly for a family visit, actually to walk the dock with me privately while everyone else napped through the worst heat of the afternoon, and to tell me the case against my mother was, in her professional opinion, ready. Ready enough that we could bring it to a contact she trusted at the FBI's Miami field office within days. Ready enough that the Monroe County State Attorney's Office would very likely pursue forgery and grand theft charges once the federal piece was in motion. Ready enough, she said, looking at me very directly, that the only decision left is yours, Elena, not the evidence's. When and where and how publicly you want this to land, because the evidence is going to convict her regardless of the venue. The only thing left to decide is what kind of ending you actually need to be able to live with. I told her about the gala. I told her about the seating chart, the designer gown, the commemorative check, the exact date 5 weeks out, the fact that half the Ridgeline Family Foundation board and half of Cascade Point Country Club's most prominent members would be in that ballroom, watching my mother stand exactly where she had spent years positioning herself to stand. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I have thought about almost every day since. Elena, I spent 22 years believing justice belonged in courtrooms and nowhere else, and mostly I still believe that. But your mother didn't just steal money from you in private. She built an entire public reputation on the story that she is a woman of means and taste and generosity, using resources she took from you while you were breaking apart from something else entirely. If you want the legal case to run its proper course, and it will, regardless, I understand completely why you might also want the moment the truth becomes undeniable to happen somewhere. She can't control the narrative afterward with a phone call to the ladies at the club. I'm not going to tell you that's vengeance instead of justice. Sometimes they're the same thing wearing different clothes. We decided that week, Patricia and I, sitting on that dock with 2 coffees going cold between us, on the shape of the ending. The legal process would begin immediately and run on its own timeline, methodical and untouchable. A referral to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit for the wire fraud and interstate elements. A parallel referral to the Monroe County State Attorney for the state forgery counts specific to the documents that had been executed and notarized within Florida. That process alone, Patricia estimated, could take anywhere from 6 weeks to 4 months to produce an indictment, longer to reach trial, and I understood and accepted that the actual criminal consequences my mother and, potentially, Marcus and Jessica would face were not going to arrive in some satisfying, immediate, cinematic instant. Real justice is slow, and paperwork and grand juries, and I had spent 9 years of my career respecting that slowness because the alternative, speed without rigor, is how guilty people go free on technicalities. What I wanted, what I let myself want without apology once Patricia gave me permission to want it, was for the moment the truth became undeniable. The moment 80 of the most socially significant people in my mother's carefully curated life understood exactly who she was, to happen in a room she could not spin, could not soften with a follow-up phone call, could not manage the way she had managed every uncomfortable truth about our family for 36 years. I needed one more piece of evidence before any of it could move, though, and it was the piece that had started this whole discovery in the first place: the box in my mother's attic, the one holding my sealed divorce paperwork, the one containing a clean, physical, traceable source of my real signature. If I could recover that box, or even photograph its contents in place, and if a forensic document examiner Patricia trusted could confirm the forged signatures on the trust withdrawal forms had in fact been traced from documents in that specific box, the forgery case moved from strong to essentially unimpeachable. The problem was straightforward. The box was in Coral Gables, in a house my mother currently did not occupy because she was busy occupying mine, which meant for the first time in 5 weeks, an empty house in Coral Gables represented an opportunity, and I am not going to pretend that the plan I built around that opportunity was entirely comfortable for me, because it required me to ask my father, directly, to help me, without telling him fully why. I chose my father for this specific task deliberately, and I want to explain the calculation, because it says something about how differently each member of this family required handling. I could not ask Marcus because Marcus cannot keep anything to himself for longer than the time it takes to find someone impressed by knowing it first. I could not ask Jessica yet, though I was beginning to suspect I eventually could, because the incentives weren't aligned enough yet for her to risk anything on my behalf. I could ask my father because Richard Vance's defining trait, passivity, the inability to act even when he suspects something is wrong, could, for once, be redirected into something useful, if I framed the request correctly, not as an accusation against my mother, but as a task, small and specific and low conflict, exactly the kind of task Richard has spent 36 years being extremely good at completing without asking uncomfortable questions. On day 14, I asked him, quietly, on the porch after everyone else had gone to bed, whether he still had a key to the house in Coral Gables, a strange question on its face, since of course he did, it was his own house, and whether he'd mind driving up for the day sometime this week to grab a box of old paperwork from the attic that I needed for something with my divorce records, insurance-related, boring stuff. A lie constructed with enough boredom baked into it that Richard would never think twice about the details. My father looked at me for a long moment on that porch, longer than I expected, the lighthouse jigsaw puzzle still half assembled on the card table behind him through the screen door, and said something that surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire story. Your mother's been different since you resigned, Elena. More stressed about money than she lets on. I don't ask about it because I've learned asking your mother about money never goes anywhere good. But I want you to know I've noticed things aren't quite adding up the way they used to, and if you ever need to talk about any of it, actually talk, I'm here. It was the closest my father had come, in 34 years, to admitting out loud that he suspected something was wrong and had chosen, as always, not to look directly at it. I told him I appreciated that, and I meant it, even as I understood with total clarity that Richard Vance was offering me emotional availability 3 weeks too late to have prevented any of what had already happened, and that an offer to talk is not the same thing as an act of protection, and it never had been, not once, across 36 years of marriage to a woman he'd watched make choice after choice he privately doubted. He drove up 2 days later and came back with the box exactly as asked, no questions, no hesitation, the box sitting innocently on the back seat of the Buick the way it had sat innocently in that attic for 7 years. I photographed every document inside it that night on the dock after everyone else had gone to sleep, cataloging each one with the same clinical distance I'd bring to any other engagement, and sent the full set to the forensic document examiner Patricia had lined up in Miami, a woman named Corinne Alvarez who had spent 19 years authenticating signatures for both prosecution and defense, and had, according to Patricia, never once been successfully challenged on cross. Corinne's report came back 9 days later, and it did not equivocate. The signature on my sealed divorce filing, dated 7 years earlier, showed structural, stroke order, and pressure point similarities to the 14 forged trust withdrawal signatures at a confidence level Corinne described, in the careful language of expert testimony, as consistent with direct visual or photographic tracing from a common source document, to a degree of certainty exceeding 98%. I read that report twice, sitting alone on the dock at 11 at night, and felt the last small, stubborn part of me that had still been holding out some hope for an innocent explanation finally close, quietly, without drama, the way a door closes when you've decided, calmly, that you're done walking through it. We referred the case formally in the 4th week. Patricia's contact at the FBI's Miami field office, a financial crimes agent named Special Agent Renata Osei, took the initial meeting herself, and I sat across a conference table from her with Corinne's report, the trust's full transaction history, the jeweler's receipt, the LLC filings, and the text message thread between my mother and Jessica laid out in chronological order, the way I had laid out evidence for prosecutors a dozen times before in my career. Except every single document on that table this time had my own family's name attached to it. Agent Osei was quiet through most of my presentation, taking notes, asking sharp, specific questions exactly where the evidence needed pressure testing. And at the end, she looked up at me and said, "Ms. Vance, I want to be straightforward with you. I've reviewed a lot of family fraud referrals in this job, and most of them are messier than this, emotionally and evidentiarily both. This one isn't messy. This one is one of the cleanest referral packages I've seen walk through that door in years, and I mean that as a genuine compliment to the work, even though I understand what it must have cost you to build it." I told her it had cost me more than I could put into a sentence that would survive being said out loud in a federal building, and she nodded, once, like a woman who had heard variations of that exact sentence before and knew better than to ask me to elaborate. The investigation moved forward from there on its own institutional timeline. Subpoenas to the trust's financial institution, a parallel forgery referral filed with the Monroe County State Attorney's Office through a contact of Patricia's named Assistant State Attorney Devin Marsh. Interviews scheduled, warrants prepared quietly enough that nothing would tip my mother off before the timing I needed. And the timing I needed, the timing Patricia and I had agreed on that afternoon on the dock, was the night of the Ridgeline Family Foundation Gala, 5 weeks out from the day my mother had called me and told me she was moving into my rental. Now less than 2 weeks away, RSVPs already confirmed at just over 200 guests, the ballroom at the Biltmore in Coral Gables already booked. My mother's gown already fitted, the commemorative check already ordered from the printer in a size specifically chosen, according to a vendor invoice I obtained through the foundation's own bookkeeping records, now that I was actively investigating its finances alongside the trust, to be large enough for excellent photographs. I had to decide in that 4th week what to do about Grant, because up until then, Loop B had been running on a separate, quieter track from the criminal case, and I could feel the two tracks converging whether I chose it or not. Denise Callahan Frey's name sat on both files now, the trust's advisory fee ledger and the Whistling Fox receipts. And I understood that the moment federal agents began pulling records connected to the foundation and the trust, Denise's financial fingerprints would surface regardless of what I decided to do personally about Grant. So the question was never whether the truth about Grant would come out. The question was only whether I would let it come out for me, on my terms, at a time and place of my choosing, or whether I would let it simply happen to me, the way it had been happening to me quietly for months while I smiled at a phone call every night and said I missed him too. I chose the gala for Grant as well, and I want to explain why, because it wasn't cruelty for its own sake, whatever anyone watching this decides to believe about me. Grant had been invited to the Ridgeline Family Foundation Gala for 2 years running, as my fiancé, seated at the family table, photographed beside my mother in the foundation's own promotional materials, as evidence of the family's continued prosperity and taste. Denise Callahan Frey was co-chairing the silent auction and would, by definition, be in that ballroom, likely within 30 feet of Grant, likely for the entire evening, 2 people who had spent the better part of a year meeting 90 minutes outside Charlotte specifically to avoid exactly this kind of proximity, about to be seated at overlapping tables in front of 200 people who knew both of their names. I did not need to engineer their exposure at all. I only needed to make sure I was standing somewhere composed, evidence in hand, when the two currents already running toward each other finally collided. The final 2 weeks before the gala were, I think, the hardest of the entire 5 weeks in the Keys. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because I had to hold an extraordinary amount of information in complete silence while continuing to share a house with every person that information concerned. My mother grew, in those final 2 weeks, noticeably more anxious, in a way I recognized instantly, because I have watched exactly this kind of anxiety before, in a dozen fraud subjects across 9 years. Not the anxiety of a woman who suspects she's been caught, but the anxiety of a woman managing a lie that is getting harder to keep organized. She mentioned, twice in passing, that the trust portal had been acting strange lately, a lie designed to plant in advance a defense that any irregularities were technical rather than intentional. She asked me, once, seemingly casually, whether I'd logged into anything financial lately, since you've had all this time, and I told her, truthfully in the narrowest possible sense, that I'd been keeping busy with a few things, and watched her accept that non-answer with visible, if carefully hidden, relief. Marcus, in those final 2 weeks, escalated rather than retreated, which I've come to understand is simply what entitlement does under any kind of pressure, even pressure he couldn't consciously name. He brought up the advisor role a third time, then a fourth, each time with a slightly larger number attached, until by the second week of August he was asking, without apparent embarrassment, whether I'd consider just being a full partner. Honestly, Elena, you clearly have nothing else going on right now, and this could be something we build together, as siblings. A sentence that managed to insult my entire 9-year career and my recent unemployment in the same breath, while asking me to fund his fifth failed venture with money he had no idea I already knew he'd stolen 4 times the amount of from our shared grandfather. Jessica, in those final 2 weeks, gave me the second piece of information that ended up mattering enormously, and she gave it to me in a way that confirmed everything Patricia and I had theorized about where her loyalties would actually land under pressure. On a Tuesday evening, 9 days before the gala, she found me again on the dock, the same spot, the same hour, and asked, without any preamble at all, whether I'd noticed how weird your mom's been acting since the whole trust thing. I kept my face perfectly still and asked what she meant by the whole trust thing. And Jessica, looking out at the darkening water rather than at me, said, "Marcus doesn't think you know. I've thought for a while you probably do. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know where the car money came from, Elena. I'm not going to sit here and lie to your face about that, because I think you're smarter than that, and I think lying to you right now would be the stupidest thing I could possibly do." I asked her, carefully, what she wanted me to do with that information. She was quiet for almost a full minute, and then she said, "I want you to know that if this goes where I think it's going, I'm not going down defending Carol Vance. I married Marcus. I did not sign up to be an accessory to his mother's crimes, and I've done the math on what protecting her costs me versus what telling the truth costs me, and the math isn't close." I wrote every word of that conversation into the file that same night, because it was, functionally, an admission, and because it told me something I needed to plan around. At least one person inside that house on Sandpiper Key was going to choose self-preservation over family loyalty the moment the truth became visible to everyone else, and that person's cooperation, whatever her original motives, was going to make the state's case against Marcus significantly cleaner. The gala itself was scheduled for a Saturday evening at the Biltmore Hotel's Grand Ballroom in Coral Gables. Black tie, 211 confirmed guests by the final count. A room my grandfather Everett Ridgeline had chosen personally for the Foundation's very first gala, 19 years earlier, because, according to family stories I'd heard my whole life, he'd once told my grandmother it was the kind of room that makes people believe good things are still possible, a sentiment my mother had, in the years since his death, quietly repurposed into a room that made people believe Carol Vance was still exactly as prosperous and tasteful as she'd always claimed to be. Patricia, Agent Osei, and Assistant State Attorney Devin Marsh and I met 3 times in the final 10 days to finalize the logistics of that evening, and I want to be honest that those meetings were, in a strange way, the calmest hours of the entire 5 weeks, because for the first time since the trust portal had loaded slowly on a Tuesday night in Brickell, I was not the only person carrying the weight of what I knew. Agent Osei explained that federal agents would not, as a rule, execute an arrest inside a public gala attended by 200 civilians unless absolutely necessary for flight risk or evidence preservation, and that the more likely and more procedurally sound approach would be a coordinated announcement. Agents present at the venue, in plain clothes, prepared to formally serve my mother, and separately Marcus, with notice of the pending charges and to escort them from the premises the moment the evidence became public knowledge within the room. Time to occur immediately after whatever moment I chose to make that knowledge undeniable to the assembled guests. Assistant State Attorney Marsh, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had prosecuted forgery cases for over 2 decades, told me plainly that the state's parallel filing would follow within days regardless of what happened at the gala itself, and that nothing I did or didn't do that night would change the ultimate legal outcome, only the manner in which the truth first became visible to the people my mother had spent years performing prosperity for. I asked Patricia the night before the gala, sitting on the dock one final time with the house dark and quiet behind us, whether she thought I was doing this for justice or for something uglier, something closer to spectacle, something my mother herself might have done if the roles were reversed. Patricia thought about it for a long time before she answered, longer than she usually took to answer anything. "Elena," she said finally, "your mother built her entire adult identity out of a room full of people believing a story about her that wasn't true, using money that was never hers to use. I don't think there's anything uglier about that story ending in the same room it was built in. I think that's just proportion. Justice doesn't always have to look modest to be real. The morning of the gala, I drove back to Coral Gables alone, having told my mother 2 days earlier that I'd decided to come back early after all, that I wanted to help with the final logistics just as she'd originally asked. A request she received with the particular warmth of a woman who believes she has successfully guilted her daughter into compliance. I spent that day exactly as any dutiful daughter would, confirming the caterer's final head count, checking in with the florist about the center's pieces, reviewing the seating chart one final time, a chart I now understood with total clarity because I had built it myself that afternoon at my mother's request, seat by seat, and had made exactly one adjustment to it that no one else in the family would notice until it mattered. I moved Grant's seat, quietly, from the family table to a table near the west wall, close enough to see everything, far enough that his removal from the room, when it came, would draw a minimum of collateral attention to guests who had nothing to do with any of it. I moved Denise Callahan Frey's seat as well, from the silent auction committee table to a table directly adjacent to Grant's, a small private cruelty I allowed myself and do not apologize for, because some part of this evening, I had decided months earlier, was allowed to be for me and only me. I wore a deep emerald gown I'd bought specifically for that night, not because I wanted to be noticed, but because I wanted, for reasons I understood only instinctively at the time, and understand much more clearly now, to look exactly like a woman who belonged in that room on her own terms. Not a guest, not an afterthought, not the daughter who'd had a hard year and needed managing. I arrived at 7:40, 20 minutes before the doors opened to guests, and found Agent Osei and 2 additional plainclothes agents already positioned discreetly near the ballroom's service entrance, dressed for the evening, indistinguishable from any other well-dressed guest at a black tie fundraiser. Except for the small radio earpieces, I only noticed because I already knew to look for them. Patricia arrived at 8, in a deep navy dress I'd never seen her wear before, and found me near the bar, squeezed my hand once, hard, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say that the two of us hadn't already said to each other on that dock a dozen times over 5 weeks. My mother arrived at 8:15 in a champagne-colored gown that had, I now knew precisely, cost $6,200, paid for through a payment plan she'd financed through the same jeweler that had sold her the tennis bracelet. And she moved through that ballroom exactly the way I'd watched her move through rooms my entire life, touching elbows, complimenting gowns, laughing at exactly the right volume, positioning herself, without ever once appearing to try, near whichever cluster of guests currently held the most social significance in the room. My father trailed a half step behind her the entire evening, the way he always has, nodding at people whose names he half remembered, occasionally glancing toward me across the room with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between pride and unease, as though some animal part of him sensed, without any conscious information to support it, that something in the architecture of this particular evening did not match the evenings that had come before it. Grant arrived at 8:30 in a tuxedo I'd helped him pick out 8 months earlier, kissed my cheek, told me I looked stunning, and asked, with the easy charm that had once made me believe I was the only interesting person in every room, whether I'd forgiven him for being distracted lately with work. I told him there was nothing to forgive. I watched his face relax, just slightly, the specific relief of a guilty man who believes he has gotten away with something for one more night. And I felt, watching that relief cross his features, the very last piece of whatever I had once felt for him settle, quietly, into something closed and finished. Denise Callahan Frey arrived at 8:40 in a burgundy gown, greeting my mother warmly, greeting me with the easy, practiced friendliness of a woman who had eaten hors d'oeuvres at my engagement party and had no idea, could not possibly have any idea, that I had spent 5 weeks documenting a wine night, 4 dinners for 2, and a $4,000 advisory fee paid from a trust she had helped my mother illegally drain. She was seated, per the chart I had built, at the table directly beside Grant's, and I watched, from across the room, the exact moment both of them realized where they'd been placed. Watched the brief, involuntary flicker of alarm cross both faces before they composed themselves into the practiced neutrality of 2 people who have spent months getting very good at hiding something in plain sight. The evening moved through cocktails, through the seated dinner, through the silent auction's opening remarks, delivered by my mother at the podium in the champagne gown, describing the Foundation's mission with a warmth and eloquence that I will admit, even now, was genuinely impressive to watch. A masterclass in exactly the kind of performed sincerity that had built her entire reputation. She spoke about my grandfather's vision, about the scholarship recipients seated near the stage, Three young people from Ridgeline, Georgia, who had genuinely benefited from money my grandfather had actually, legitimately, generously set aside for them. Money that had nothing to do with the trust she'd been stealing from. And I want to be honest that watching those three young people applaud my mother, believing every word of her speech, was one of the more complicated moments of that entire night. Because their gratitude was real, even though the woman receiving it, for that speech, had spent the last year stealing from her own daughter to fund a jeweler's bracelet and her son's fifth failed venture. The commemorative check moment came at 9:50, exactly as planned. My mother and the foundation's board chair posing beside an oversized printed check representing the year's total fundraising. Cameras flashing, applause moving through the ballroom in warm, generous waves. And it was in the 30 seconds immediately following that photograph, while my mother was still standing at the podium, still glowing with the specific satisfaction of a woman at the exact peak of a reputation she had spent years constructing, that I walked to the small standing microphone set up near the edge of the stage for the evening's brief remarks from family members, a tradition I'd participated in every year since my grandfather's death, and one no one in that room had any reason to suspect I would use for anything other than a warm, familiar toast. I want to tell you exactly what I said, because I had rehearsed it, quietly, alone in my rental house on Sandpiper Key, more times than I'm willing to admit, and because every single word of it was true, sourced, and provable, which is the only kind of sentence I have ever trusted myself to say out loud in a room full of witnesses. Thank you all for being here tonight, celebrating the legacy my grandfather, Everett Ridgeline, built for this town and these students, I said. And my voice, to my own considerable relief, came out steady, warm even, the voice of a woman offering a toast. I've spent the last 5 weeks learning something about legacy that I want to share with you, because I think it matters more tonight than any other night this foundation has ever held its gala. I paused, the way you pause before evidence, the way I have paused 100 times in front of juries who didn't yet know what was coming. 11 months ago, I resigned from my position as a forensic accountant after 9 years, because I discovered my firm had accepted money to bury a pension fraud case I'd built against a corporate executive. I want you to hold on to that because it's relevant. I have spent my entire career finding the exact place where someone's signature says one thing and the truth says another. I felt the room's attention shift, felt 200 conversations quiet into a single held breath, felt my mother's smile, still frozen from the photograph, begin, very slightly, to falter. In the 11 months since I resigned, $191,412 was withdrawn from my late grandfather's family trust. In 14 separate transactions, each one bearing my forged signature, traced from a document sealed in a box that had sat, for 7 years, in my mother's attic. I did not raise my voice. I did not look away from my mother's face, which had gone, in the space of that single sentence, entirely and unmistakably pale. I have spent 5 weeks building the evidentiary case that proves this, working with a retired federal prosecutor, a forensic document examiner, and, as of 2 weeks ago, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and the Monroe County State Attorney's Office, both of whom have confirmed that formal charges are forthcoming. The ballroom, I want you to understand, did not erupt into chaos the way a movie might show it. It went, instead, into a specific kind of silence I have only ever heard a handful of times in 9 years of courtrooms. The silence of 200 people simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they knew about a person standing 8 feet in front of them. My mother said my name once, Elena, in a voice that cracked in a way I had genuinely never heard from her before. Not once in 34 years, and I said, still steady, still holding the microphone, "I'm not finished, Mom." And I told them about Denise Callahan Frey, seated 11 feet from where I stood, about the $4,000 advisory fee paid from the trust for coaching on streamlining distribution timing, about the 4 documented weekends at the Whistling Fox Inn in Highlands, North Carolina, about a fiancé who had told me he was in Charlotte for due diligence meetings, a location and industry did not require. I watched Grant's face, across the room, go the particular color of a man understanding, in real time, in front of 200 witnesses, that every quiet, careful lie he had told over the better part of a year had just been laid out in a single, unbroken sentence with dates attached. Agent Osei and her 2 colleagues moved forward at exactly that moment, discreet, professional, unhurried, and I watched my mother's champagne gown, still catching the ballroom's light exactly as the designer had intended, get escorted, not dragged, not cuffed in that room, nothing so theatrical, simply escorted, firmly, quietly, by a woman with an earpiece and a badge, toward a side exit, while Assistant State Attorney Marsh's own contact confirmed, in a brief, quiet exchange near the stage that I only partially overheard, that Marcus, standing frozen near the bar with a drink he never finished, would be receiving formal notice within the week regarding his own role in receiving proceeds he had reason to know were unlawfully obtained. Jessica, I noticed, did not move toward Marcus at all. She stood very still near the edge of the dance floor, watching the entire scene unfold with an expression I can only describe as relief, wearing the shape of shock. And I understood, watching her, that whatever came next for her marriage, she had already made her decision weeks earlier, on a dock, in the dark, and everything happening in that ballroom was simply the moment the rest of the world caught up to a choice she'd made privately in advance. I did not follow my mother out of that ballroom. I want to explain that choice, because I think it's the part of this story people misunderstand most when they hear it secondhand. I did not need to watch her escorted through a service hallway to feel finished with anything. I stayed exactly where I was, at the microphone, and I looked out at 211 people who had spent an evening applauding a woman they now understood. In the space of about 90 seconds, they had never actually known. And I said one more thing before I set the microphone down, because I owed it, I think, to the 3 scholarship recipients sitting near the stage, whose gratitude had been the one entirely genuine thing in that entire performance. My grandfather built this foundation to give young people from Ridgeline, Georgia, a chance he never had, I said. Nothing about tonight changes what this foundation does for them, or what it should keep doing. I'll be taking over as interim board chair, effective immediately, and every dollar in this foundation's accounts will be independently audited starting Monday morning, by a firm I trust, at my own expense, so that no one in this room ever again has to wonder whether the story they're being told matches the numbers behind it. That got applause, actual applause, uncertain at first and then steadier, the specific applause of a room deciding, collectively, in real time, which version of this family it wanted to believe in going forward. The rest of that night moved in fragments, the way genuinely significant nights often do once the single hardest sentence has already been said. Patricia found me near the bar, 20 minutes later, and simply put her arms around me, tightly, for longer than either of us usually allows ourselves, and said quietly, into my shoulder, "Your grandfather would have been so unbearably proud of you tonight, and so unbearably sad it ever had to happen at all. And both of those things are true at the same time. Honey, you're allowed to feel both." My father found me an hour after that, standing alone near the terrace doors, and he didn't say much. Richard Vance has never in his life said much in the moments that matter most, but he stood beside me, quietly, for a long time, watching the last of the guests filter out into the Coral Gables night, and eventually he said, "I should have looked harder, a long time ago. I'm sorry it took this for me to say that out loud." I told him it was a start. I meant it, and I also meant, privately, that a start 8 months into a felony is a very different thing than a start 8 months before one, and that the difference between those two timelines was something Richard Vance would have to sit with for the rest of his own life, not something I owed him absolution for on the same night his wife was formally charged. Grant left the gala alone, and Denise Callahan Frey left separately, at a careful, humiliated distance from each other, neither one able to look at me on the way out, and I did not go after either one, because there was nothing left to say to a man who had spent a year building an elaborate second life 90 minutes outside Charlotte, while telling me, nightly, that he missed me. I filed the engagement ring back to him by certified mail 2 days later, along with a formal notarized letter dissolving any financial claims either of us might have made through our shared household account, drafted by an attorney Patricia recommended, because even in heartbreak, I have never once in my life failed to make sure the paperwork was clean. The weeks that followed the gala moved with the particular strange quiet that follows any genuinely enormous rupture. The quiet where the outside world keeps functioning at its normal pace while your own internal timeline feels like it's running through wet sand. The federal indictment against my mother came down 6 weeks after the gala. 3 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of aggravated identity theft, tied directly to the forged trust distributions, each count carrying a potential sentence that, combined, exceeded 20 years. Though Assistant State Attorney Marsh told me privately that a plea arrangement was far more likely given her age, lack of prior record, and the overwhelming, unimpeachable nature of Corinne Alvarez's forensic signature analysis. The state forgery charges followed 4 days later, filed in Monroe County, tied specifically to the documents notarized within Florida's jurisdiction. My mother ultimately pleaded guilty 11 months after that gala to a reduced set of charges in exchange for full restitution and cooperation in the related investigation into Denise Callahan Frey's advisory role, and was sentenced to 4 years in a federal facility followed by 5 years of supervised release, along with an order to repay the full $191,412 plus interest, a sum I have, as of the day I'm telling you this, received back in full. Not because I needed the money by that point, but because I needed the number on paper to say zero, needed the case file to close the exact way every other case I'd ever built had closed. Cleanly, provably, completely. Marcus was charged separately, a lesser count related to receiving proceeds he had reason to know were unlawfully obtained, and reached his own plea agreement 8 months after the gala, avoiding prison time in exchange for full cooperation. A substantial fine he is, as far as I can determine from public court records, still paying off in installments, and a mandatory financial literacy and ethics course that I will admit, uncharitably, I have found a small, private, entirely unprofessional amount of satisfaction imagining him sitting through. Jessica was never charged with anything at all because she cooperated fully and voluntarily with both the federal and state investigations the moment she was approached, providing the group text thread I had already found on my own, along with additional detail about conversations she'd overheard between my mother and Marcus that neither of them had ever expected would surface. She and Marcus divorced 4 months after the gala. I have had lunch with Jessica twice since then. Strange, careful, oddly warm lunches between two women who have almost nothing left in common except having survived the same family from two very different angles. And she told me, at the second lunch, that she'd started her own small consulting business. Actually legitimate this time, actually functioning, and that some days she still couldn't quite believe how long she'd let herself stay quiet about things she'd known were wrong, simply because staying quiet had, for a long time, been easier and more profitable than telling the truth. My father filed for divorce from my mother 4 months after the gala, the first genuinely decisive act I have ever, in 34 years, witnessed Richard Vance take on his own initiative, without being asked, without my mother's guidance, without anyone's permission at all. He moved into a small condo near Southridge High, the school where he'd taught for 31 years, and took up woodworking, of all things, building small, careful, patient things with his hands. And he calls me now most Sundays, actual calls, actual conversations, the kind we never once had while my mother filled every silence in every room he ever stood in. I don't know if I've fully forgiven him for 36 years of watching and saying nothing. I know that I've started to understand him differently, as a man who spent his whole life mistaking passivity for peace, and who is, very late, very slowly, learning the difference. Denise Callahan Frey lost her insurance and annuities license within the year, following a state licensing board investigation triggered by the criminal referral, and I understand, secondhand, through people who still move in Cascade Point circles, that she moved out of Coral Gables entirely, to somewhere in the Panhandle, somewhere no one at that club talks about anymore because there's no version of that story that reflects well on anyone who was ever friendly with her. Grant's private equity fund quietly let him go 8 months after the gala, in what the fund's public statement described only as a mutual decision unrelated to fund performance, though I have my own professional suspicions about what an internal compliance review might have turned up regarding a man who had spent a year telling his fiancée, and likely, his firm, 2 different sets of lies about his whereabouts. He reached out to me once, 5 months after the gala. A long message I read once, carefully, and never responded to, because some doors, once you've built the case proving exactly why they needed to close, simply do not need to be reopened for the sake of someone else's closure. I want to tell you about my own year, because I think it matters more than the punishments, more than the plea deals, more than the specific arithmetic of who paid what fine and served what sentence. In the 3 months after the gala, working through the independent audit of the Ridgeline Family Foundation that I had promised that room at the microphone, I found something I did not expect to find, something that changed the entire shape of what came next for me professionally. The foundation's finances, once separated cleanly from anything my mother or Denise had touched, were healthy, well-structured, exactly as legitimate as my grandfather had built them to be, and the scholarship program itself had, in 19 years, sent 41 first-generation students from Ridgeline, Georgia to college, a number I had genuinely never known before that audit. A number that made me understand, with a clarity I hadn't expected, that even inside a story this ugly, something real and good had survived underneath it, untouched, waiting for someone to actually look after it properly. I stayed on as interim board chair for 4 months, restructured the foundation's financial oversight so that no single family member would ever again hold unilateral control over its disbursements, a two-signature, third-party audited structure I designed myself, drawing on 9 years of exactly the kind of institutional fraud prevention I used to be paid to advise other companies on. And then, once the structure was solid, I stepped back to a regular board seat and let a professional executive director, hired through a proper search process for the first time in the foundation's history, take over day-to-day operations. The 3 scholarship recipients from that gala night wrote me a card the following spring, thanking me for making sure the money keeps doing what it was always supposed to do, and I keep that card in the top drawer of my desk, in the office I opened 4 months after the gala, because it is, I think, the single cleanest piece of evidence I own that something worthwhile came out of the worst year of my life. The office is in Coral Gables, 6 blocks from where Callaway Voss still operates, a small, 3-person forensic accounting practice I named Ridgeline Forensic Advisory, a name I chose deliberately, publicly, unapologetically, because I decided somewhere in those months that I was done letting my family's damage define which parts of my own history I was allowed to be proud of. I took 2 clients with me from my old professional network in the first month. Referrals from attorneys who had worked with me at Callaway Voss and had never quite trusted Dale Whitcomb's judgment after the Preston Okafor case quietly disappeared. By the end of the first year, Ridgeline Forensic Advisory had built cases that led to 2 separate federal indictments for corporate fraud. One embezzlement case worth over $4 million at a regional healthcare company, and, in a piece of professional symmetry I still find almost funny in a very dark way, a referral from a mutual contact regarding new evidence in a pension fraud matter that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to a case I'd once been told, at my old firm, had been resolved internally. I can't discuss the specifics of that engagement, but I can tell you that Preston Okafor's name appeared in documents I reviewed within that first year of running my own practice, and I can tell you that some doors, once closed by someone else's cowardice, eventually find their way back open if you're patient enough and good enough at what you do. I want to talk about the money for a moment, not because it's the point, but because I think people watching this deserve honesty about the actual arithmetic of what winning looked like, since so much of this story started with a number that didn't add up. The $191,412 came back to me in full, through my mother's restitution order, over a payment schedule that concluded 14 months after her plea. The $42,000 I'd spent on the rental house in the Keys was never coming back, and I decided, somewhere in that first year of running my own practice, that I didn't want it to. That $42,000 had bought me something no restitution order could ever replace, which was the specific, irreplaceable 6 weeks in which I finally had enough distance from my family's noise to notice, clearly, for the first time in my adult life, exactly how loud that noise had always been, and exactly how much of my own instinct I had spent 34 years quietly overriding in order to keep the peace inside a house that had never once, in return, kept the peace for me. I went back to that house on Sandpiper Key, alone, for a long weekend, almost exactly a year after the gala. I sat on that same dock, at the same hour, watching for the same heron, and it wasn't there that particular evening, which felt, in a strange, private way, correct. Some things you don't get to have twice, and that's all right. I thought about my grandfather Everett Ridgeline, about a small town in Georgia he'd built half a life's work around, about a trust he'd structured specifically to require 2 signatures because he'd wanted, even from beyond his own death, some small institutional safeguard against exactly the kind of concentrated, unaccountable trust that had let my mother believe, for almost a year, that no one was ever going to check the math. I thought about how he used to tell me when I was very young, sitting at that kitchen table in Ridgeline learning cursive, that numbers don't lie, people do, and that the whole discipline of accounting, properly practiced, was really just the patient, unglamorous work of listening to numbers until they told you the truth a person was trying to keep from you. I didn't fully understand that sentence as a child. I understand it now with a completeness that occasionally still takes my breath away, sitting alone on docks, remembering. Patricia and I talk every week now, sometimes more, and she has become, in the most literal and important sense, the mother figure I actually needed for most of my adult life without ever quite admitting it to myself. She retired fully from any consulting work with the state attorney's office the year after the gala, finished restoring that bungalow in Key West, and spends most of her time now exactly as she always wanted to, reading novels instead of grand jury transcripts, though she still calls me, every few months with sharp, specific, prosecutor's eye questions about whatever new engagement my firm has taken on. Because some instincts, she tells me, don't retire even when the job does. If you're still watching this, if you've made it this far, I want to leave you with the one thing I actually learned from all of it. The thing underneath the money and the forged signatures and the ballroom and the escorted exit through a service hallway in a champagne gown. It's this. The people who tell you that love means never checking the math are almost always the people who have the most to lose if you actually do the math. Real love survives scrutiny. Real love survives you asking a hard question and getting an honest answer. What doesn't survive scrutiny was never love in the first place. It was management, it was performance, it was a story someone needed you to keep believing so they could keep spending resources you hadn't agreed to give them. I spent 34 years believing that asking my own family for an honest accounting would be a betrayal of the relationship. I know now it would have been the only thing that could have actually protected it, if any of them had been capable of surviving an honest answer. Some of them weren't. I had to learn to be all right with that. I'm still learning it, some days more successfully than others. So let me ask you the question I've been sitting with for over a year now, the one I still don't have a clean answer to, the one I think about on docks, in courtrooms, in a small office in Coral Gables with my grandfather's name on the door. How much of what the people closest to you tell you is a story they need you to believe, and how much of it is actually true? And what would it cost you, really cost you, to finally check? I haven't told you yet about the deposition, and I think you need to hear it, because it's the moment the entire 5 weeks of quiet, careful work finally stopped being a private file on my laptop and became something with a court reporter's transcript and my own sworn signature attached to it, and I remember every detail of that room with a precision I don't apply to most days of my life. It happened 9 weeks after the gala, in a conference room on the 14th floor of a federal building in downtown Miami. Glass walls, a view of the port I'd once driven past on the night I decided to keep my 6 weeks in the Keys exactly as scheduled. Assistant United States Attorney handling the federal side, a woman named Priya Natarajan, sat across from me with a stack of exhibits 3 inches thick. Every single document I had gathered myself, now formatted, tabbed, exhibit stamped, transformed from a grieving daughter's private investigation into Exhibit 14, Exhibit 22, Exhibit 31. My mother's defense attorney, a heavyset man named Foster Halloway, who specialized, according to his own firm's website, in white-collar defense for discerning clients, a phrase I found almost unbearably funny given the circumstances, asked me questions for nearly 3 hours, trying, methodically, to find some crack in the chronology, some place where my grief over Callaway Voss might have colored my perception of what I found in that trust portal. Some place where a daughter's resentment toward a domineering mother might have inflated an honest misunderstanding into a federal case. I answered every single question the way I have answered questions in depositions for 9 years. Flatly, factually, with dates and figures instead of feelings, refusing every single invitation he offered me to get emotional, to get defensive, to give him a single sentence he could use to paint me as an unreliable, vindictive daughter, rather than a forensic accountant who happened to also be the victim. At one point, nearly 2 hours in, Halloway asked me directly whether I enjoyed building a criminal case against my own mother, a question designed, transparently, to bait me into either a denial that would sound insincere or an admission that would sound monstrous. I remember the specific stillness that came over me before I answered, the same stillness I used to feel in a conference room at Callaway Voss, the instant before I found the transaction that broke a case wide open. I didn't enjoy any part of building this case, Mr. Halloway, I told him. I enjoyed, very much, the 11-minute conversation with my Aunt Patricia on her porch in Key West, where I finally said out loud what I already suspected, because that was the first time in almost a year I felt like someone in my life was going to tell me the truth, regardless of how it made anyone feel. Everything after that was just work. I'm very good at my work. That's not the same thing as enjoying what the work was about, Priya Natarajan told me afterward, walking me to the elevator, that it was one of the cleanest depositions she'd sat through in years, and that Halloway's own body language by the 3rd hour had told her everything she needed to know about how confident he actually felt about his client's chances at trial. I want to go back further, too, to something I haven't told you yet, because I think it explains why I was capable of doing any of this at all, why some other daughter in my exact position might have found a way to look away and I didn't. When I was 9 years old, the same year my grandfather taught me cursive at that kitchen table in Ridgeline, Georgia, I asked him why he'd built the foundation to give scholarships to strangers instead of just giving more money directly to our own family. Because I remember, even at 9, sensing that my mother resented the foundation's existence in some way I couldn't yet name. My grandfather set down the pen he'd been using to guide my handwriting and told me something I didn't fully understand until I was much older. Elena, the people who love you the most honestly are the ones who can look you in the eye and tell you something true even when it costs them something to say it. The people who love you the least, honestly, are the ones who only ever tell you what keeps the money coming. I built this foundation for strangers because strangers have never once had a reason to lie to me about anything, and I wanted, before I died, to know at least a few relationships in my life that weren't built on somebody managing what I was allowed to know. I didn't understand, at 9, that he was talking about my own mother, his own daughter, in that sentence. I understand it now with a clarity that still, occasionally, takes the wind out of me. There's a scene I haven't described yet that I think about often, because it happened 3 days after the gala, before any of the legal proceedings had really begun to move, when I drove to the Coral Gables house one last time to collect a few things Richard had asked me to grab for him, since he was staying, temporarily, with a colleague from Southridge High, while the divorce filing worked its way through the courts. My mother was not there. She was, by that point, already released on bond pending trial, staying with a cousin 2 counties away who had agreed to house her under conditions of her release. But the house itself felt different in a way I didn't expect. Quieter, smaller, stripped of whatever performance had always filled every room of it. I found, in the front hallway, on the same table where she'd always displayed a rotating selection of framed photographs, chosen specifically for how they made the family look to visitors, a single photograph that had never been part of that rotation. Me, at maybe 6 years old, sitting at my grandfather's kitchen table in Ridgeline, tongue between my teeth in fierce concentration, learning cursive, his hand steadying mine. I don't know why she'd kept that photograph tucked behind the others, never displayed, never chosen for the rotation of curated family prosperity. I took it home with me. It's on my desk now, next to the thank you card from the scholarship recipients, the only 2 objects in that entire office that have nothing to do with any client's case file, and everything to do with the 2 people who ever actually told me the truth, without needing something from me in return. The reaction at Cascade Point Country Club in the weeks after the gala moved through the specific stages of a certain kind of social ecosystem, processing a scandal among its own. First disbelief, then a flurry of private phone calls I only heard about secondhand through Jessica, and occasionally, through Patricia's own remaining contacts in Coral Gables society. Then, within about 6 weeks, a kind of quiet, collective decision to simply stop mentioning my mother's name at all. The specific social erasure reserved for people whose fall from grace is too complete and too well documented to be spun into anything more forgivable than silence. I ran into one of my mother's closest friends from the club committee, a woman named Genevieve Ashcroft, in a grocery store parking lot 4 months after the gala, and she approached me, awkwardly, and said only, "I had no idea, Elena. Truly, none of us had any idea." A sentence I have come to understand as the specific thing people say when they want you to know they weren't complicit, without quite apologizing for the years they spent admiring the version of my mother that fraud had built. I told her I believed her. I did, mostly. It didn't change very much about how I felt standing in that parking lot. I want to tell you one more thing about Marcus, because it's the detail that surprised me most out of everything that happened in that first year after the gala, and because I think it complicates the story in a way that matters. The mandatory financial ethics course, part of his plea agreement, ran 12 weeks, once a week, at a community education center in Kendall, and I know this only because Jessica told me about it during our second lunch, months after their divorce, in the specific tone of a woman who still, despite everything, held a small residual hope that some part of the man she'd married for 6 years might actually be capable of change. Marcus, according to Jessica, had gone into that course expecting to sit through 12 hours of box-checking bureaucracy, and had come out of it somewhere around week 8, telling her, unprompted, in a phone call she almost didn't answer, that a case study the instructor had used, a father who'd embezzled from a family trust to fund a business his adult son was certain would finally prove him capable, had made him physically ill in the parking lot afterward, because he recognized, apparently for the first time in his entire adult life, that he had spent 6 years being exactly that son, over and over, 4 separate times, funded by money he'd told himself, each time, was simply family helping family. I don't know if that recognition is permanent or if it was the specific, temporary remorse people manufacture when consequences finally catch up to them. Jessica doesn't know either. She told me she's chosen not to find out by staying in his life to watch, because 6 years of finding out the hard way was enough data for one lifetime. I understood that completely. I didn't need to ask her to explain it further. Denise Callahan Frey's full unraveling took slightly longer than my mother's, moving through the slower machinery of a state licensing board rather than a federal court. But it was, in its own way, more thorough. The Florida Department of Financial Services opened a formal investigation into her advisory work 6 weeks after the criminal referral named her, and that investigation, through subpoenaed records I was never shown directly but heard about through Assistant State Attorney Marsh's office, uncovered that the Ridgeline Family Trust had not been her only client relationship, built on exactly this kind of quiet, technically legal-sounding advice about streamlining access to funds a client didn't fully control. 2 other families in 2 other counties had filed complaints once her name became publicly associated with my mother's case. Complaints that had apparently sat dormant for years because no one involved had ever felt confident enough or believed themselves credible enough to push them forward until my own case gave the licensing board a reason to look harder. I think about that sometimes. How many other Elenas were out there, quietly suspecting something was wrong with their own family's finances, who might never have pushed hard enough to find out, if my particular case hadn't cracked the door open first. I don't know their names. I know that Denise Callahan Frey lost her license permanently, faced a civil suit from at least one of those other families, and moved, as I mentioned, somewhere in the Panhandle where, according to the last thing I heard about her secondhand, she now works retail at a home goods store, a fact I neither celebrate nor mourn, because it simply is what it is, the specific, unglamorous, entirely predictable consequence of building an entire adult life on other people's blind trust. I started seeing someone new about 10 months after the gala, a structural engineer named Thomas Ferris I met, of all places, at the reopening of a renovated public library branch in Coral Gables that the Ridgeline Foundation had partially funded. A small, unglamorous, entirely undramatic beginning to something I am still, carefully, cautiously, letting build at its own pace. I told him everything, all of it, on our 3rd date, sitting at a quiet restaurant with far worse wine than Casa Rota ever served but far better company, because I decided a long time ago, sitting on that dock with a folder named Charlotte open on my laptop, that I was never again going to let someone learn who I really was through a receipt I found by accident. Thomas listened to the entire story without once interrupting, and when I finished, he asked me exactly one question, the only question anyone has ever asked me about any of this that actually mattered. What do you need from me, going forward, that nobody in your family ever gave you? I told him, honestly, that I needed someone who could survive me checking the math. Someone who understood that scrutiny wasn't an accusation, that an honest accounting between 2 people who trust each other should feel like safety, not suspicion. He has, so far, 11 months in, survived every single audit I have quietly, instinctively run on his own consistency. And I recognize, some nights, lying awake beside him, that this specific, unglamorous kind of peace is the thing I actually built all of this toward. More than the restitution, more than the plea deals, more than watching my mother's champagne gown disappear through a service hallway. My relationship with my mother, if you're wondering, does not currently exist in any meaningful sense. She writes me letters from the federal facility where she's serving her sentence, roughly once a month, and I have read every single one of them, because I believe, even now, in reading things fully before deciding how to respond to them. The letters follow a pattern I recognize instantly from 9 years of studying exactly this kind of psychology in fraud subjects across dozens of cases. An opening paragraph of genuine-sounding remorse, a middle section that gradually, subtly, shifts the framing toward her own suffering, her own humiliation, her own loss of social standing, and a closing paragraph that asks, in careful, indirect language, whether I might consider visiting or writing back, or at least letting your father know you don't blame him the way you clearly blame me. I have not responded to a single one. I don't know if I ever will. Patricia tells me there's no deadline on that decision. That forgiveness, if it ever comes, doesn't owe anyone a specific timeline. And that the only thing I actually owe myself is honesty about whether any response I might eventually send is coming from healing or from the same old habit of managing everyone else's feelings before my own. I'm still working out which one it would be. I suspect I'll know when I know, and not one moment before. I get asked sometimes by people who hear pieces of this story secondhand how I actually knew where to look, technically, in that trust portal, on that first Tuesday night in Brickell, And I think the answer matters, because it's the part of this that isn't really about my family at all. It's about a skill anyone can learn, and I wish more people understood how accessible it actually is. Fraud, in almost every case I've ever built across 9 years, hides in the gap between what a number is supposed to look like and what it actually looks like. And the trick is never intuition, it's baseline. You cannot spot an anomaly unless you first know, with total precision, what normal looks like for that specific account, that specific person, that specific pattern of behavior. I knew the Ridgeline Family Trust's normal shape because I had built it myself 8 years earlier. Quarterly distributions, a specific narrow range of dollar amounts, 2 signatures required every single time. The moment 14 distributions appeared clustered irregularly instead of quarterly, in amounts that varied wildly instead of sitting in a narrow, predictable band, I didn't need intuition to know something was wrong. I needed one number, compared honestly against a known baseline, and the rest followed the way it always follows, one verified fact leading cleanly to the next, the same methodology whether the subject is a stranger's pension fund or your own mother's bank account. If there's a single practical thing I want anyone watching this to take away, beyond the specifics of my own family, it's this. Check your own baselines, on everything that matters to you, regularly, without guilt. Whether that's a joint account, a family trust, a business partnership, or simply the pattern of promises someone close to you makes and either keeps or doesn't. The people who have nothing to hide will never resent you for checking. The people who resent you for checking are telling you something important, usually before you're ready to hear it. I went back to Ridgeline, Georgia itself for the first time in over a decade, 6 months after the gala, alone, on a quiet Tuesday, to visit my grandfather's grave and to see, in person, the small county library the foundation's very first scholarship class had helped fund 19 years earlier. It's a town of just under 3,000 people, the kind of place where the diner still serves coffee in real ceramic mugs, and the woman behind the counter still remembers your grandfather's order 20 years after he stopped coming in to place it himself. I sat at his grave for almost an hour, telling him, out loud, alone in that quiet Georgia cemetery, everything that had happened since the last time anyone in this family had properly visited. The trust, the forgery, Grant, the gala, the audit, the office with his name half borrowed into my own firm's name. I don't know if any part of him could hear any of it. I know that saying it out loud, in that specific quiet, standing over the ground where a man who taught me cursive and honesty in the same breath now rests, felt like the closest thing to absolution I have found anywhere in the entire process. Closer than the plea deal, closer than the restitution check, closer than watching my mother's gown disappear through that service hallway. The 3 scholarship recipients from that gala night, I should tell you, are doing well, genuinely well, in the specific, unglamorous way that matters more than any story anyone tells about them at a fundraiser. One of them, a young woman named Talia Brooks, finished her degree in civil engineering the spring after the gala, and wrote to the foundation's new executive director, asking whether she might come speak at next year's event about what the scholarship had actually made possible for her family. An offer the foundation accepted immediately, and I made a point of being there, in person, in the audience rather than at the podium the year she gave that speech, because I wanted at least once to sit in that ballroom and watch it be exactly what my grandfather had always intended it to be, a room where people believed good things were still possible, and where that belief, for once, wasn't resting on a story someone had constructed to hide something rotten underneath it. I think about the heron sometimes, the one that was standing so still in the shallows the first evening I arrived at that house on Sandpiper Key, before any of this had started, before the phone rang, before I knew any of what I was about to learn about my own family. I've read, since then, that herons hunt by patience more than speed. They stand motionless for what looks, to an outside observer, like doing absolutely nothing, until the exact moment the water tells them everything they need to know, and then they move, once, precisely, completely, and it's over before anything watching from a distance even fully registers that something has changed. I didn't understand, that first evening, watching that bird do what herons have always done, that I was about to spend the next 5 weeks of my life learning to do exactly the same thing, patient and still and unreadable, until the water finally told me everything I needed to know, and then moving, once, completely, in a ballroom in front of 211 witnesses, and it was over before most of the room even fully registered that anything had changed until it already had. I don't know what the next chapter of my own life looks like yet, not entirely, And I've stopped needing to know every detail of it in advance, the way I used to need to know every detail of every case file before I felt safe closing it. I know the firm is growing. I know Thomas asked me 3 weeks ago, in the quietest, least dramatic way imaginable, whether I'd thought at all about a future that included him permanently. And I know I told him the truth, which is that I have. Carefully, cautiously, the way I do everything now, checking my own baselines against my own instincts before I trust either one completely. I know my father calls me every Sunday, and some Sundays we talk about nothing at all. The weather, a woodworking project, a book he's reading, and I've come to understand that ordinary conversations about nothing at all are, themselves, a kind of repair. The plainest, least dramatic evidence that a relationship might actually be capable of surviving honesty after 36 years of surviving on performance instead. I never told you exactly what my mother said to me in that ballroom. In the seconds between the moment my voice went quiet and the moment Agent Osei's colleague reached her elbow, and I think you deserve that piece, because it's the sentence I turn over most often, more than the depositions, more than the sentencing hearing, more than anything else in the entire year. She didn't deny it. I want to be precise about that, because some part of me had half-expected denial, a scene, tears, an accusation that I was destroying the family out of jealousy or resentment, the kind of counterattack I had genuinely braced myself for across 5 weeks of planning. She didn't do any of that. She looked at me, her face gone, the specific gray-white of a woman watching her entire architecture collapse in real time, and she said, quietly, only loud enough for me to hear over the room's rising murmur, "I always meant to pay it back before you'd notice." And that sentence, more than any single piece of forensic evidence I'd gathered across 5 weeks, told me everything I needed to know about the actual shape of her remorse. Not regret that she had stolen from her own daughter, but regret, specifically and only, that her timeline for getting away with it had run out before she'd managed to close the gap quietly enough for me never to have to know it all. I have thought about that sentence at least once a week for over a year now. I expect I'll keep thinking about it for a long time after this. There's a piece of the Grant story I haven't told you either, something I only learned 4 months after the gala, through an old contact at his former fund who reached out to me, unprompted, after news of his termination became loosely known in certain finance circles in Miami. According to this contact, the fund's internal compliance review, triggered quietly by questions raised after his name surfaced publicly in connection with my mother's case, discovered that Grant had, for at least the preceding 2 years, been quietly using fund resources, a company credit card, an expense account meant for client travel, to cover a portion of those weekends at the Whistling Fox Inn, categorizing them internally as prospective client development travel, for a deal that, as far as the compliance review could determine, never actually existed. In other words, the man who had told me he was doing due diligence in Charlotte had also, separately, been quietly defrauding his own employer to fund the exact same lie, and I sat with that information for a long time before I understood why it didn't actually surprise me at all. Some people don't tell one lie in isolation. They build an entire architecture of them, each one supporting the others, until the whole structure becomes so load-bearing that the person living inside it forgets which parts were ever true to begin with. Grant sent the letter I mentioned earlier roughly 1 month after that termination became final, and though I never responded, I did read it in full, twice, and I can tell you honestly that most of it was an explanation I didn't ask for and don't need, except for one line near the end that I've allowed myself to believe, cautiously, might have been genuinely true. I don't expect you to believe this, but the version of myself I liked best in the last 4 years was the one you thought you were marrying, and I'm sorry I never became him instead of just performing him. I don't know if that's true. I've decided it doesn't actually matter whether it's true, because either way, the performance is the only version of him I was ever actually given. And performances, however sincerely delivered, do not make good husbands. Jessica's consulting business, the one she mentioned at our second lunch, has grown faster than either of us expected, and I think the reason matters, because it says something true about her that the rest of the family never once bothered to notice across 6 years of underestimating her. She works, now, almost exclusively with small business owners, navigating exactly the kind of murky, undocumented, family-adjacent financing that had once nearly destroyed her own marriage, helping first-time entrepreneurs formalize loans from relatives, draft clear repayment terms, separate emotional obligation from financial structure, before those blurred lines could calcify into exactly the kind of resentment and quiet theft that had defined 6 years of her own life with Marcus. She told me at that second lunch that she'd started the business almost as a form of penance, though she used a gentler word for it, something closer to making sense of it. And I told her I thought that was one of the most legitimately productive things anyone in this entire story had managed to build out of the wreckage, myself included. She laughed at that. Actually laughed, the first time I'd heard her laugh freely in the entire 2 years I'd known her, and said, "God, Elena, we're all just running trauma-shaped businesses now, aren't we?" And I told her that as far as coping mechanisms go, ours were at least generating W-2s. I want to close this out properly, with the one image that has stayed with me most clearly across the entire year, more than the ballroom, more than the deposition, more than the cemetery and ridgeline. It's from the third week in the Keys, before any of the confrontation had happened, before the gala, before the FBI referral, on an ordinary Tuesday evening when my father, uncharacteristically, joined me on the dock instead of retreating to his jigsaw puzzle, and sat beside me in silence for almost 20 minutes before saying anything at all. When he finally spoke, he didn't ask about the tension he must have sensed building in that house, didn't ask why I'd started disappearing for long private conversations with Patricia, didn't ask any of the questions a more attentive father might have asked. He said, instead, looking out at the water, "Your grandfather used to say, the tide always tells you the truth, eventually, you just have to be patient enough to stay on the dock long enough to see it come in." I didn't say anything back. I just sat there, beside him, watching the water do exactly what water does. Patient, inevitable, indifferent to how long anyone had spent hoping it might stay out. I attended the sentencing hearing myself, 11 months after the gala, in a federal courtroom 2 floors below the conference room where I'd given my deposition, and I want to describe it because it was, in its own quiet, procedural way, more difficult than the gala itself had been, precisely because there was no microphone for me to stand at, no room full of witnesses I could address directly, nothing to do with my hands except sit, still, in the second row, and listen. My mother wore a plain gray suit, nothing like the champagne gown, her hair pulled back simply, no jewelry at all, and I understood, watching her walk in beside Foster Halloway, that whatever performance had defined every public appearance of hers I'd ever witnessed had finally, completely, run out of material. The judge, a measured woman named Judge Alicia Ferrante, who had clearly read every page of the sentencing memorandum both sides had submitted, asked my mother directly, before pronouncing sentence, whether she had anything she wished to say. My mother stood and for a long moment said nothing at all. And then, in a voice I barely recognized, stripped of every social performance I'd spent 34 years learning to read, she said, "I convinced myself for a long time that taking care of appearances was the same thing as taking care of my family. I understand now that it was never the same thing at all, and I understand that my daughter is the only person in this room who ever actually held both things, appearances and the truth underneath them, with any integrity, and I wish I had learned that from her instead of the other way around." I did not cry in that courtroom. I want to be honest that some small part of me wanted to, not out of forgiveness, but out of something closer to grief, for the mother I might have had if she'd been capable of saying that sentence 11 months, or 11 years earlier, when it might have actually changed something instead of simply describing, accurately, for the first time, what had already been lost. Judge Ferrante sentenced her to 4 years, followed by 5 years of supervised release, and ordered full restitution, exactly the outcome Assistant State Attorney Marsh had projected months earlier, and the entire proceeding, start to finish, took less than 90 minutes. 90 minutes to formally close a case that had taken 5 weeks to build and would take, in the end, close to a year to fully resolve through every stage of the legal process. I remember standing outside the courthouse afterward, in the specific bright, indifferent Miami sunlight that doesn't care what's just happened inside the building behind you, and Patricia standing beside me, and neither of us saying anything for a long moment, until she finally said, "That's it, honey. That's the whole thing, start to finish, exactly as clean as we built it to be." I told her it didn't feel like an ending, exactly. She told me it wasn't supposed to feel like one yet, that endings in this line of work rarely feel like the movies make them feel, that mostly they just feel like the specific, quiet relief of a number finally landing where the paperwork always said it should. I drove back to my office in Coral Gables that same afternoon, past Callaway Voss's building on Ponce de Leon Boulevard, the same parking garage where I'd typed my resignation letter standing beside my car nearly 2 years earlier. And I sat in that parking garage for exactly as long as it took me to notice, really notice, that the version of myself who'd sat there that first time, hollowed out and directionless, would not have recognized the woman sitting in that same garage now, running her own firm, her grandfather's name on the door, a forensic accountant who had built her single hardest, cleanest, most important case not against a stranger's fraud, but against her own family's, and had survived it, completely, on her own terms, exactly the way she'd survived every other case in 9 years. Patiently, precisely, and without a single sentence in the entire file that wasn't true. There's one more thing I need to tell you, though, something that happened just 2 weeks ago, something I haven't fully processed yet, which is part of why I'm telling you all of this tonight instead of waiting until I understood it completely. A woman reached out to my firm through our general contact form, no name attached beyond an initial, asking whether Ridgeline Forensic Advisory took on cases involving suspected fraud within blended families, specifically involving a stepfather she believed had been quietly siphoning funds from a trust her own late father had established. Structured, she wrote, almost exactly the way I've heard your own family's trust was structured, which is actually why I'm reaching out to you specifically. I read that message standing in my office at 8 in the evening, alone, the thank you card and the photograph of me and my grandfather sitting on the desk in front of me, exactly where they always sit, and I understood, reading it, that this story, my story, the one I've just spent this entire time telling you, was never actually going to end cleanly at a sentencing hearing, the way Patricia had suggested it might. Because stories like this don't end, they just keep finding new people standing at the exact edge of the same discovery I once made on an ordinary Tuesday night in Brickell, staring at a number that doesn't add up, trying to decide whether they're brave enough to find out why. I haven't responded to her yet. I will, tomorrow morning, first thing, because that's always been the job, long before it was ever personal, and because if there's one thing 9 years and one devastating family betrayal have taught me beyond any doubt, it's that the people who reach out asking someone to help them check the math are never, not once, the ones who actually have something to hide. I should tell you about the wedding too, since I never circled back to it directly, because unwinding an engagement turns out to be its own strange, bureaucratic grief entirely separate from the emotional one. Grant and I had, before any of this, put down deposits with 6 different vendors for an April wedding we'd been planning for over a year. A venue in Coconut Grove, a caterer who specialized in a specific kind of Mediterranean-inspired menu Grant's mother had requested, a florist, a string quartet, a photographer, and a calligrapher for the invitations we'd never actually sent. I spent an entire Saturday in the second week after the gala, alone at my kitchen table, working through each cancellation methodically, the way I work through everything, calling each vendor personally, rather than hiding behind an email, because I felt I owed each of them the basic decency of an actual human voice explaining why a wedding that had existed, in their books and their calendars and their deposit ledgers, for over a year, was no longer going to happen. 4 of the 6 released our deposits without argument, standard cancellation policy, no drama. The caterer kept 60% per her contract's cancellation terms, which I didn't fight because a contract is a contract and I have spent my entire career respecting exactly that principle even when it cost me personally. Only the calligrapher, a woman named Odile who had already spent 3 weeks hand-lettering sample invitations we'd approved, cried on the phone with me, genuinely, generously, and told me she was just so sorry. Whatever happened, you sounded like you were building something real. And I thanked her, and paid her in full for work we'd never actually use. Because some things are worth paying for even when the thing itself never gets delivered. I moved out of the Brickell condo 4 months after the gala, not because I couldn't afford it, but because every room in it still held some residue of Grant's presence. His side of the closet, still half full the day I final boxed it up myself rather than asking him to come collect it. The specific brand of coffee he liked that I kept buying out of habit for 2 months before I noticed I was doing it. I found, packing up that closet, a small velvet box tucked behind a stack of his sweaters, containing a pair of cufflinks I'd bought him for our first anniversary, engraved with a date that no longer meant what it was supposed to mean, and I sat on the closet floor for longer than I'm willing to admit, holding those cufflinks before I put them in a donation box along with everything else, because keeping them would have meant keeping some private shrine to a version of the relationship that had never actually existed outside of my own willingness to believe it did. The new apartment I found, closer to my office in Coral Gables, has exactly 1 framed photograph on display in the entire living room, and it isn't of Grant, and it isn't, notably, of my mother. It's a photograph Patricia took herself, on her phone, the night of the gala, after everything had happened, of me standing alone on the Biltmore's terrace in the emerald gown, looking out at the lit fountain below, not smiling, not performing anything for the camera at all, just standing there, still, the way a heron stands still, having already done the one necessary thing it came to that water to do. I remember sitting in the waiting area outside Agent Osei's office the first time, before that referral meeting, more nervous than I had been walking into any courtroom in 9 years of testifying against total strangers, because I understood, sitting in that particular plastic chair with Corinne Alvarez's signature report in a manila folder on my lap, that the moment I walked through that door and laid every document on that table, I was closing a door behind myself that would never fully reopen. There would be no version of my family, going forward, unmarked by what I was about to formally set in motion. Corinne herself had walked me through her methodology 2 days earlier, in her small office in Miami lined with reference books on question document examination, showing me under magnification the specific stroke order tells that distinguish a person's own natural signature from even a highly skilled forgery, the pressure a person naturally applies at the start of a letter versus the end, the microscopic hesitations a trained eye can find at the points where a forger's pen had to pause and reorient itself against a traced source, rather than moving in the single fluid motion of genuine muscle memory. Real signatures have confidence built into their imperfections, Corinne told me, tracing a finger along a projected image of my own real signature beside one of the forged withdrawal forms. Forged signatures, even good ones, have hesitation built into their precision. Yours has 34 years of confident imperfection behind it. This one, and she tapped the forged form, was trying too hard to be perfect, which is exactly the thing that gave it away. I asked her, sitting in that office, how she could be so certain, professionally, that this wasn't simply an unusually careful attempt by someone with a naturally similar handwriting style, because I needed, even then, even convinced of what I already believed, to hear the case stress-tested by someone whose entire career depended on being right. She told me that in 19 years and over 1,100 signature examinations, she had testified in court exactly 6 times where her initial finding had been successfully challenged, and none of those 6 cases had involved a forgery this structurally clear. "I don't tell people what they want to hear, Ms. Vance," she said. "I've turned down retainers from attorneys who wanted me to find ambiguity in signatures I was certain were genuine, because ambiguity that isn't actually there doesn't help anyone. It just delays the truth a little longer at your expense. What I'm telling you is not what you want to hear. It's simply what's true. I understand those aren't always the same thing, in your family's case especially, but they happen to align here, and I think some small part of you already knew that before you walked in today." Talia Brooks' speech at the following year's gala is something I still think about more than almost anything else that came out of that whole ordeal, because it's the piece that had nothing to do with my family's punishment and everything to do with what the money had actually been for all along, before anyone touched it who shouldn't have. She stood at that same podium, in a simple navy dress, 23 years old, freshly graduated, and told the room that she was the first person in her family's history to finish a 4-year degree, that her mother had worked 2 jobs in Ridgeline for 11 years to make sure Talia never had to choose between textbooks and groceries, and that the scholarship, $4,000 a year for 4 years, hadn't just paid tuition, it had paid for the specific, unglamorous freedom of not having to work a 5th job on top of a full course load, freedom to actually study instead of merely surviving her own education. She said near the end, looking out at the room, "I know there was a difficult year for this foundation. I wasn't in that ballroom for the difficult part, but I heard about it, the way everyone eventually hears about everything in a town small enough to still remember your grandfather's coffee order. I want to say, on behalf of every student this scholarship has ever helped, that we never once needed this foundation's board to be perfect. We needed the money to actually reach us, honestly, the way it was always supposed to. Thank you for making sure it still does." I sat in that audience, in the audience and not at the podium, and felt something in my chest finally, genuinely, settle in a way none of the legal proceedings, none of the depositions, none of the sentencing hearings' careful procedural closure had quite managed to do. That was the actual ending, I think, the one that mattered more than any courtrooms. Not my mother's sentence, not Grant's termination, not Denise's ruined license, but a 23-year-old woman standing at a podium, saying thank you for money that had finally, fully, gotten to do the only job it was ever supposed to do. I hired my first 2 employees at Ridgeline Forensic Advisory within the same month I opened the office, and I chose them both deliberately, for reasons that connect back to everything you've already heard. The first, a junior forensic analyst named Priya Osman, 26 years old, had been let go from a larger firm in Fort Lauderdale after raising concerns, internally, about a partner potentially steering a client away from reporting suspected embezzlement to protect a lucrative ongoing engagement. A story that landed close enough to my own experience with Dale Whitcomb that I hired her within one interview, because I wanted on my very first team at least one other person who had already proven, under pressure, that she wouldn't bury a finding to keep a client comfortable. The second, an office manager and junior bookkeeper named Harold Weiss, 61 years old, had spent 30 years at a single accounting firm before retiring early when the firm was acquired, and told me in his interview that he'd grown tired of watching younger partners chase growth at the expense of exactly the kind of careful, unglamorous rigor that actually protects clients, and that he wanted, in the last stretch of his career, to work somewhere small enough that rigor still mattered more than billable hours. I think about the two of them often, sitting in our small suite of offices 6 blocks from Callaway Voss, and I think about how strange and quietly satisfying it is that the firm I built out of the worst year of my life turned out to attract exactly the kind of people who'd been punished, elsewhere, for the same instinct that had eventually saved me, the refusal to look away from a number that didn't add up, no matter who it belonged to, no matter what it cost to say so out loud. There's a specific memory from the week right before the gala that I keep coming back to. One I haven't described yet. From the last night everyone was still together in that house on Sandpiper Key before I drove back to Coral Gables alone to help with final logistics. It was late, past midnight, and I couldn't sleep, so I went down to the kitchen for water and found my mother already there, sitting at the table in the dark, not doing anything, just sitting, in a way I'd genuinely never seen her sit before, without her phone, without a magazine, without the constant low hum of performance she usually carried into every room even when she thought no one was watching. She looked up at me and said quietly, "Do you ever feel like you're running out of road, Elena? Like you've been driving so long towards something you can't even name anymore? You're not sure what happens if you actually get there?" I didn't know, standing in that kitchen doorway with a glass of water in my hand and a federal referral already scheduled for the following week, whether she was talking about money, about the marriage to my father that was already quietly disintegrating, about the gown, the gala, the seating chart, or about something else entirely, some deeper exhaustion she'd never once let herself name out loud in front of any of us. I told her I understood that feeling better than she probably realized. She looked at me for a long moment in the dark kitchen, and for just a second, one single second, I thought I saw something almost like recognition pass across her face, as if some small part of her already knew, already sensed, the shape of what was coming for her, and simply didn't yet have the courage to ask me directly whether it was true. I said goodnight. I went back upstairs. I did not sleep at all that night, and neither, I suspect, did she, though for very different reasons, neither one of us was ready to say out loud in that kitchen, in the dark, 6 days before everything either of us thought we knew about our own family changed for good. I think about all of it now less as a single story with a single villain and more as a slow, patient unraveling of an entire family's shared agreement to never check the math on each other, an agreement that had protected every one of us, in its own way, from ever having to fully look at who we actually were beneath the roles we'd all quietly agreed to keep performing. My mother needed to be seen as prosperous. Marcus needed to be seen as promising. My father needed peace more than he needed truth. Grant needed to be the man everyone believed he already was, rather than doing the work of actually becoming him. And I needed for far too long to be the daughter who didn't ask hard questions, because asking hard questions in that family had always quietly meant risking being the one who loved everyone else less than everyone else needed to be loved. I don't carry that particular need anymore. I'm not sure exactly which day I stopped carrying it, whether it was the night on the dock with the phone call, or the night in Corinne Alvarez's office watching my own signature magnified beside its forgery, or the 90 seconds at that microphone in the Biltmore's ballroom, but I know it's gone now. And I know I wouldn't take it back, even if someone offered me the version of my life where none of this ever had to happen at all. Because that version of my life was never actually peaceful. It was only quiet, and I have learned, this year more than any other, that those two things are not remotely the same. That woman who emailed the firm 2 weeks ago, the one asking about her stepfather and a trust structured almost exactly like mine, I called her this morning, before I sat down to tell you any of this, and the first document she sent over already has a signature on it that doesn't quite sit right. The same kind of too careful precision Corinne once taught me to spot, and if you've been paying attention this whole time, you already know exactly where a case like that eventually goes. You've sat through my whole family's math tonight, so you already know what I'm capable of finding once I start looking, and I think you're curious enough about how her story ends to already know you're going to be back here waiting for the next one. So go ahead and hit subscribe now, because we both already know you were going to anyway, and because next time, The math might belong to someone standing far closer to you than you would ever expect it to be standing.